The scratch of 100 nibs filled the room, a dry, insectile chittering that seemed to burrow into the plaster of the high ceiling where shadows pooled like stagnant water. Arthur Groom dipped his pen, the nib catching a globule of black iron gall that threatened to blot the page before he even began, forcing him to pause. He wiped it on the edge of the inkwell, a ceramic pot chipped at the rim, leaving a smear of permanent stain on his thumbnail that no amount of scrubbing would ever shift. Around him, the other clerks hunched over their desks, shoulders rising and falling in a synchronized rhythm of labor, their faces pale and waxy under the green glare of shaded lamps. Coal dust settled on the windowsills, a fine gray grit that mirrored the complexion of the men who worked beneath it, breathing in the soot of a city that refused to wash itself clean. A heavy thud broke the rhythm. Constable Miller stood at the end of the aisle, chest heaving slightly under the weight of the wooden box he carried with both hands. The man's tunic smelled of wet wool and the damp fog that clung to the streets outside, a sharp contrast to the stale tobacco and sour paper scent of the CID record room. He set the box on Groom's desk, the impact sending a tremor through the stack of blank transcript forms waiting to be filled with other people's sins. "Essex Constabulary," Miller said, his voice rough, as if he had been swallowing smoke all morning instead of air, "sealed, direct from Ilford." Groom nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady against the sudden quiet that rippled out from the desk. He reached for the box, his fingers brushing against the rough wood that felt cold despite the warmth of the room. A wax seal, crimson and cracked, held the lid fast, stamped with the crest of the Essex Constabulary in relief. He took a small knife from his drawer, the blade dull from overuse, and slid it under the wax until the seal crumbled, falling onto the desk in red flakes that looked disturbingly like dried blood against the pale wood. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that smelled of rain and cellar damp, lay the personal effects of a woman accused of murder. Groom peeled back the cloth. The contents were mundane, a hairbrush with bristles matted with dark hair, a small bottle of perfume, and a bundle of letters tied with a fraying blue ribbon. He lifted the bundle, feeling the slight weight of them, the paper thin and fragile as onion skin that might tear under the weight of a thumb. As he untied the ribbon, a scent rose to meet him, cutting through the room's stale air with startling clarity. Lavender water, sweet, cloying, and utterly domestic. It belonged in a bedroom with drawn curtains, not here, under the harsh judgment of the law. "Smells like a parlor in here, Governor," Miller muttered, shifting his weight from one foot to the other while avoiding the box. The constable's eyes darted to the letters, then away, as if looking directly at them might contaminate him with their intimacy. "Strange things, ain't it, writing all that down?" "People write many things they do not mean," Groom replied, his voice sounding too loud in the sudden quiet of the room, echoing off the tiles. He kept his eyes on the top letter. The handwriting was sloping, hurried, the ink varying from deep black to a faded gray where the nib had run dry. "My dearest Fred," it began. The words seemed to vibrate on the page, alive with an urgency that made Groom's stomach tighten. "Chief Inspector wants them transcribed by morning," Miller said, leaning in slightly as he lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Says there's poison in the ink." He added that she planned it all out in these pages. Groom flinched, a small, involuntary movement that he hoped Miller hadn't seen in the dim light. He traced the loop of a Y in the signature, Edith, wondering what kind of woman wrote of poison, while the scent of lavender still clung to her stationery. Was she a monster, as the newspapers claimed, or merely someone who had run out of ways to scream? "Did she say that?" Groom asked, keeping his tone neutral, professional, though his hand rested heavily on the desk. "Did she admit to planning?" Miller snorted, a short, sharp sound. "She admitted to writing. That's enough for the Old Bailey, innit? Ink spills harder than steel." The constable straightened his tunic, pulling at the collar that seemed to choke him. "Don't take too long, Arthur. The chief is pacing up in his office like a man waiting for a verdict, wants this file closed before the week is out." "And the husband?" Groom asked, the question slipping out before he could check it. "Mr. Thompson?" "Dead," Miller said, the word landing with a flat finality that offered no room for appeal, detailing how the husband had been stabbed on the pavement right outside his own door in a bloody mess they said was found while he still wore his hat. Miller shook his head, a gesture of vague pity that didn't reach his eyes. "Funny thing, though, Found this box in the wife's dressing room, hidden under a pile of petticoats, like she knew we'd come looking. Groom looked down at the letters again, hidden under petticoats. A secret life tucked away beneath the layers of respectable society. He felt a sudden, inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the damp London autumn seeping through the grime-streaked windows. The lavender scent seemed stronger now, overwhelming, filling his lungs until he felt dizzy. "Right," Groom said, picking up his pen. His hand trembled slightly, just once, before he stilled it against the desk. "I'll begin immediately." Miller lingered for a moment, watching Groom position the first letter under the lamp. The light caught the sheen of the oilcloth, casting long, distorted shadows across the desk. "Careful, Arthur," the constable said softly, turning to leave. "Once you read them, you can't unread them. They stick to you like the ink." The door clicked shut, sealing Groom alone with the dead woman's words. He dipped his pen again, the nib hovering over the fresh sheet of official bond paper. The first line of the letter stared back at him, the ink still glossy where Edith Thompson had pressed too hard. "I wish he was dead." The words were simple, brutal, and devastatingly clear. Groom began to write, copying the script onto the official form, but as the nib scratched across the paper, he felt as though he were not just transcribing evidence, but carving a tombstone. The lavender scent clung to his fingers, stubborn and sweet, a ghost of the woman who had pressed the nib to the page. The latch lifted, not a knock, but the dry click of metal on metal, sharp enough to slice the thick air before the door swung inward. Chief Inspector Wallinger filled the frame. He did not enter so much as occupy the space, his grey suit absorbing the weak light from the corridor, leaving the room dimmer in his wake. No hat, no coat, just the man, solid and immovable as the granite steps outside, smelling faintly of carbolic soap and the damp wool of a raincoat left too long in a hallway. "Groom." One word, flat. It landed on the desk between the lavender-scented letters and the pot of black ink, demanding attention without raising volume. Groom set his pen down. The nib left a small, dark pool on the blotter, bleeding into the fibers before he could stop it. He stood, the chair scraping harshly against the linoleum, a sound that made his own teeth ache. "So." Wallinger stepped inside, closing the door with a heel that pushed it shut with a soft, final thud. He walked to the desk, his boots silent on the floor, and looked down at the open letter. He did not pick it up. He did not lean in to smell the perfume that still clung to the paper, ghostly and out of place among the stale tobacco smoke. He simply stared at the looping script, his face a mask of carved stone that gave nothing away. "Miller tells me you have the bundle," Wallinger said, his voice low, a rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest rather than his throat. The Essex Constabulary were thorough, if nothing else. They swept the house clean. "The box arrived 10 minutes ago, sir. I have just begun the inventory." "Inventory is for lost property. This is evidence of a capital crime." Wallinger finally moved, extending a hand to point at a specific paragraph near the bottom of the page. His finger hovered an inch above the paper, careful not to touch the surface, as if the ink itself might burn him. "Read that line aloud." Groom looked down. The words swam slightly in the green-shaded light, the handwriting hurried, the pressure of the pen tearing small holes in the thin onion skin. "The shadows lengthen over the gasworks, Fred, and I feel the poison of this house seeping into my bones." "The shadows lengthen over the gasworks," Groom recited, his voice sounding thin in the large room, "and I feel the poison of this house seeping." "Stop," Wallinger dropped his hand, declaring it poison. "She writes of poison 2 weeks before her husband is found with a blade in his gut on the pavement at Ilford. It is a metaphor, sir, likely referring to her unhappiness. The context suggests her." "Context is for novels, Groom, not for the Old Bailey." Wallinger turned then, fixing him with eyes that were pale and unblinking, devoid of any curiosity about the woman who had written the words. "We are not here to diagnose her melancholy. We are here to establish intent, premeditation. The prosecution requires a map, and these letters are the terrain." He walked around the desk, the movement slow and deliberate, circling Groom like a shark assessing a seal. The smell of him intensified, the carbolic cutting through the lavender, a sterile assault on the senses. Thompson was stabbed 6 times, Wallinger continued, speaking to the back of Groom's head now. In the back, while walking home, a coward's death, some might say, but the law sees only the planning. Did she wish him dead? Yes. Did she discuss methods? Yes. Did she speak of escape, of a life with another man, of removing the obstacle that stood in her way? She speaks of love, sir, of a sailor named Bywaters. Bywaters is the blade, she is the hand that guides it. Wallinger stopped beside him, leaning in close enough that Groom could see the grey stubble on his jaw, the tiny broken capillaries near his nose. Your task is simple. Transcribe every word. Do not summarize, do not sanitize. And when you encounter passages that speak of death, of drugs, of plans to flee the country, you mark them, red ink, in the margin. Red ink, sir. To draw the eye, Bodkin will need to find them quickly when the trial begins. We cannot have the jury drowning in her flowery prose. They need to see the steel beneath the ribbon. Wallinger straightened up, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve, though the fabric appeared immaculate. She thinks she is writing a romance, a tragedy, perhaps. We must ensure the court sees it for what it is, a confession. Groom felt a tightness in his throat, a physical constriction that made swallowing difficult. He looked at the letter again. The words, "my dearest Fred," seemed to shimmer, the affection in them suddenly grotesque under the chief inspector's scrutiny. And if the context exonerates her, the question slipped out, unbidden and dangerous. If the letters show she was afraid, that she was trapped. Wallinger's expression did not change. Not a flicker of annoyance, no narrowing of the eyes. Just a cold, bureaucratic indifference that was far more terrifying than anger. Exoneration is not the purpose of this room, Groom. Accuracy is. You write what is on the page. Let the judges decide what it means. But remember this. He leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a whisper that scraped against Groom's ear. A woman who writes of poison rarely dies of old age, and a man who reads too much into her sorrow may find himself complicit in her crime. He stepped back, the distance between them suddenly vast again. Have it on my desk by 8 tomorrow, every page, every stain, every lie she told herself. So. Wallinger turned and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch, looking back not at Groom, but at the box, the oilcloth, the bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. Lock it when you leave, he said, and wash your hands before you go home. That scent, it lingers. The door opened. The noise from the corridor rushed in for a second to the shout of a messenger, the clatter of a typewriter before the latch clicked shut again. Silence returned, heavier than before. Groom stood alone. The green lamp buzzed faintly, the filament vibrating with a sound that seemed to drill into his skull. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, just slightly, a fine vibration in the fingers that held the pen. He flexed them, trying to still the motion, but the image of Wallinger's hovering finger remained burned into his vision. Poison! He picked up the pen. The nib was dry now. He dipped it into the inkwell, the black liquid swallowing the steel tip. He pulled it out, a drop clinging to the side, heavy and dark. He brought the nib to the official transcript paper, the rough surface waiting to receive the words. I feel the poison of this house seeping into Cisadilla bones. He wrote it. The scratch of the nib was loud, abrasive, tearing the fiber of the paper. He reached for the red pencil, the wood unpainted and rough under his thumb, and drew a line in the margin next to the word poison. The red mark looked like a wound on the white page, bright, violent, final. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, a grey wall that hid the world beyond the yard. Somewhere in that mist, a woman sat in a house in Ilford, perhaps waiting for a letter that would never come, unaware that her words were already being carved into the stone of her own execution. Groom dipped the pen again. The ink stained his finger, a smudge of black that would not wipe away. He rubbed at it with a rag, but the color remained, deep in the whorls of his fingerprint. He stopped rubbing. He picked up the next letter. The scratch began again. The scratch began again, a dry, insectal rasp that seemed to fill the high-ceilinged room, drowning out the distant, muffled roar of London traffic beyond the grime-streaked windows. Groom pressed the nib harder than necessary, the steel tines spreading slightly as they dragged across the rough fiber of the official transcript paper. He was copying the date now, September 1921, but the numbers looked alien, detached from the calendar he knew, belonging instead to a timeline measured in desperation and stolen glances. The ink flowed too freely, a dark river escaping the channel of his control, pooling slightly where his hand hesitated over the salutation. "My dearest Fred." The words sat on the page, innocent enough in isolation, yet heavy with the weight of the chief inspector's warning. They were not just greetings. They were coordinates for a collision course that had already ended in blood on the pavement of Staines Road. He paused, lifting the pen to let the wet gloss of the ink settle, watching the light from the green-shaded lamp fracture across the liquid surface. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, cold and itching, tracing a path through the stubble of his cheek before vanishing into his collar. The room smelled intensely of the letters now, the lavender water rising in warm waves from the paper, clashing with the stale tobacco smoke that had soaked into the woodwork of the desk over decades. It was a cloying, feminine scent, utterly out of place amongst the files of burglaries and drunken assaults that lined the shelves behind him. It made his stomach turn, a physical revulsion that had nothing to do with nausea and everything to do with the violation of reading someone's most private thoughts while knowing they would be read aloud in a court of law by men who would sneer at them. Groom shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight, a sharp sound that made him flinch. He looked at the next paragraph. Edith Thompson wrote of a theatre visit, of a play they had seen together, of the way the gaslight caught the gold in Frederick's hair. She described the sensation of his hand on hers in the dark of the circle, a touch that she claimed burned brighter than any stage spotlight. Groom transcribed it, his handwriting mimicking the flow of her script, becoming a conduit for her longing. But as he formed the letters, he felt the disconnect, the jarring fracture between the warmth of her memory and the cold purpose of his task. He was not preserving a memory, he was cataloguing a motive. Every adjective of affection was being converted into evidence of obsession, every declaration of love twisted into a strand of the noose. "I wish he was dead." The sentence appeared on the third page, sudden and stark amidst the flowery prose of romantic fantasy. Groom's hand stopped. The nib hovered a fraction of an inch above the paper, trembling visibly now, casting a tiny, shaking shadow over the word dead. He stared at it. The ink was still wet, glistening like a fresh bruise. He could hear Wallinger's voice in his head, flat and devoid of mercy. "A woman who writes of poison rarely dies old." Was it a figure of speech? A dramatic flourish borrowed from the novels she devoured? Or was it a blueprint, drawn in ink and sealed with a kiss? He did not know her. He did not know the sound of her laugh or the texture of her voice. He only knew these marks on paper, these black scratches that were supposed to contain the entirety of a human soul. He reached for the red pencil. The wood was unpainted, rough against his thumb, the lead sharp and unforgiving. He pressed it to the margin beside the sentence. The red line he drew was thick, violent, a slash of color that bled into the texture of the paper. It looked like a wound. It looked like a verdict. He felt a sudden, sharp urge to crumple the page, to throw it into the grate where the fire had long since died down to gray ash, to destroy the evidence of her despair before it could be used to kill her. His fingers curled around the edge of the transcript, the paper crinkling under the pressure. "Stop." The command came from nowhere, or perhaps from the deep, ingrained instinct of a clerk who knew that disobedience was a luxury he could not afford. He smoothed the page back down, his palm pressing flat against the words as if trying to push them back into the inkwell. The damage was done. The red line stood there, accusing and permanent. He dipped the pen again, the movement mechanical, his mind drifting away from the room, away from the yard, to a house in Ilford where a woman might be sitting by a window, watching the fog roll in from the gasworks, wondering why her lover had not written. Did she know? Did she feel the scratch of his nib in some phantom limb of her conscience? Or was she safe in her delusion, believing that these words were only for Fred, locked away in the secret drawer of a dressing table, safe from the prying eyes of the law? The clock on the mantelpiece ticked, the sound loud and rhythmic in the silence, marking the seconds that were slipping away for both of them. Tick, another line of text. Tick, another red mark in the margin. Tick, the accumulation of guilt, page by page. Groom worked faster now, the handwriting becoming slightly jagged, the loops of his Ys and GS tightening as his grip on the pen grew more desperate. He wanted to finish. He wanted to reach the bottom of the stack, to close the box, to wash the scent of lavender from his hands and forget the face of the woman he had never met. But the stack did not seem to diminish. For every page he turned, two more seemed to appear, the oilcloth bundle endless, a bottomless pit of confessions and dreams. He turned to the next letter, the paper thinner this time, almost translucent, the ink blurred in places where a tear might have fallen. She wrote of fear now, of shadows lengthening in the hallway, of a husband who watched her with cold, suspicious eyes. She spoke of wanting to escape, to run away to a place where the rain did not fall so hard and the coal smoke did not choke the sky. Groom transcribed the word escape, and as he did, he felt a cold draft seep through the window frame, raising the hairs on his arms. It was October, the fog season, the time when the Thames exhaled its damp breath over the city, sealing everything in a grey shroud. He pulled his cardigan tighter around his shoulders, but the chill remained, settling deep in his bones, just as she had written. I feel the poison of this house seeping in. He wrote the words, and this time he did not hesitate to mark them. Red, red, red. The margin became a bloody border, framing her terror in the color of alarm. He was building the case against her, brick by brick, word by word, with the precision of a mason constructing a tomb. And the terrible irony of it sat heavy in his gut, a stone he could not digest. He was the only one who saw the whole picture, the only one who held the entire mosaic of her mind in his hands, yet he was powerless to explain it. His accuracy was her destruction. If he wrote poorly, if he missed a nuance, perhaps there would be doubt. But he wrote well. He wrote with a clarity that left no room for ambiguity. He was making her guilt undeniable. A fly buzzed against the windowpane, a dull, frantic thudding sound that broke his concentration. He looked up, his eyes stinging from the strain of the lamplight. The glass was fogged on the inside, condensation running in rivulets down to the sill. Beyond it, the world was invisible, erased by the weather. He felt trapped, sealed in this room with the dead and the dying, the air growing thick with the smell of drying ink and old fear. He needed air. He needed to walk, to feel the cobblestones under his feet, to hear the voice of a living person who was not speaking through the medium of a letter written months ago. He finished the page, the final full stop landing with a definitive dot. He set the pen down, the click of the nib against the inkwell sounding like a gunshot in the quiet. He leaned back, the chair groaning in protest, and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. When he pulled them away, smudges of black ink remained on his skin, embedded in the lines of his palms. He stared at them, turning his hands over. They looked dirty, stained by the work, by the words he had just given form. He reached for the rag on the desk, the one he used to wipe spills, and scrubbed at the marks. The fabric was coarse, scratching his skin, but the ink did not come off. It had seeped too deep, settling into the whorls of his fingerprints, a permanent brand of his complicity. He stopped scrubbing. The rag fell from his hand, landing softly on the desk. It was no use. The stain was there, and it would remain, a reminder of the night he helped to write a death warrant in the name of accuracy. He looked at the stack of letters remaining in the box. There were so many, dozens of them. Nights and nights of this scratching, this marking, this slow, methodical destruction of a life. He felt a sudden, overwhelming fatigue, a weariness that went deeper than muscle or bone, settling in the very center of his being. He wanted to leave. He wanted to lock the box and walk away, to pretend he had never seen the blue ribbon, never smelt the lavender, never read the words that pleaded for love in a world that only understood judgment. But the clock ticked on, tick. The deadline loomed, tick. Wallinger would expect the file in the morning, tick. The machinery of the Old Bailey waited for no man's conscience. Groom took a breath, the air tasting of dust and regret, and reached for the next letter. His hand moved automatically, picking up the pen, dipping it into the well. The scratch began again, louder this time, more insistent, filling the room with the sound of a soul being transcribed into evidence. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the glass, a grey, suffocating weight that promised to keep the secrets of the night locked inside until the morning brought the light of judgment. The file landed on the desk with a dull thud, displacing the rag and sending a small cloud of dust motes dancing in the green-shaded light. Groom nodded, though the movement felt stiff, mechanical. He pulled the folder closer. The paper was rougher than the onion skin of the letters, a coarse, grey, pulpy stuff that absorbed the ink before it could dry. Statement of Edith Charlotte Thompson, taken at Cannon Row Police Station, 16th October 1922. The date stared back at him, a mere day after the arrest, when the shock would still be raw, vibrating under the skin like a plucked wire. He began to read. The typed words were sterile, stripped of the flourishes that adorned her private notes. Here, there were no metaphors about gasworks or seeping poisons. There was only a flat, terrified denial. I never intended harm to my husband. The letters were fantasy. We wrote to escape the boredom. It was a game. Groom picked up the latest transcription, the page still damp with his own ink. He laid it beside the statement. The juxtaposition was violent. On the left, the fiery, desperate woman who spoke of powders and glass with a terrifying specificity. On the right, this subdued creature claiming it was all a parlor trick, a mere diversion from the drudgery of a marriage to a traveling salesman. Which one was real? Or was the truth somewhere in the jagged space between them, in the gap where fear turned fantasy into something tangible? He reached for his pen, intending to mark a passage in the statement where she claimed not to recall the date of a specific letter. It was a minor discrepancy, a slip of memory that any person under duress might make. But he knew, with a cold certainty that settled in his stomach, how this would be used. The prosecution would not see a frightened woman struggling to keep her dates straight. They would see a calculatress weaving a web of deceit, altering her story to fit the evidence as it emerged. A lie within a lie. His nib hovered over the paper. The urge to write in the margin was physical, a twitch in his fingers that demanded release. He wanted to scribble, "She is terrified. She is trying to minimize the damage. This is not deception, it is survival." He wanted to explain that the powders were likely references to the patent medicines she took for her nerves, or perhaps a literary allusion to a novel they had both read, anything but the arsenic the police now suspected. He pressed the nib down. A single drop of black ink bloomed on the page, a dark, expanding star. Zdob. He lifted the pen. The rules were absolute, no commentary, no interpretation. The clerk was a conduit, a mirror that reflected only what was placed before it. To add his own voice was to contaminate the evidence, to give the defense a reason to dismiss the entire transcript as biased. And yet, to remain silent was to let the distortion stand unchallenged. He wiped the ink blot with his thumb, smearing it into a grey smudge that looked like a bruise. The room seemed to shrink around him. The other clerks continued their rhythmic scratching, a sound like insects feeding on wood, oblivious to the moral catastrophe unfolding on his desk. They processed thefts, assaults, fraudster crimes of opportunity or desperation. But this was a crime of language, of words twisted until they snapped, and he was the one sharpening the blade. He turned the page of the statement. Edith described her husband, Percy, with a strange, detached affection. He was a good man, kind in his way. We had our differences, but who does not? It was a bland, safe assessment designed to placate the officers taking the notes. It bore no resemblance to the suffocating presence of the husband in the letters, the obstacle that needed to be removed, the shadow that blocked out the sun. Groom felt a headache blooming behind his eyes, a tight, hot pressure that made his vision swim. It was the same pain he got when he tried to read in poor light, but this was deeper, rooted in the conflict between what he knew and what he was required to record. He rubbed his temples, his fingers leaving faint streaks of ink on his skin. Problem, Arthur. Miller was watching him now, an eyebrow raised, a cigarette dangling unlit from his lip. No, Groom said, his voice sounding thin, brittle, just checking the dates. She has them mixed up. Good, Miller grunted as he turned back to his work, insisting that inconsistencies are gold, which must be highlighted with a red pencil, so don't be shy. Groom looked down at the file. He picked up the red pencil. It felt heavy, weighted like a tool of execution rather than correction. He drew a line under the date discrepancy. The red mark screamed against the black type, drawing the eye, demanding attention. It looked like an accusation. He moved to the next paragraph. Another denial, another claim of innocence. I would never hurt a fly. and beside it, in his own handwriting, the words, "If only we could drink poison together and die." The dissonance was deafening. It roared in his ears, drowning out the scratching of the pens, the distant traffic, the hum of the city outside. How could one person contain such contradictions? How could the same hand that wrote of tender longing also plot, however vaguely, a violent end? Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the human heart was not a single, coherent thing, but a collection of conflicting impulses, and the law, with its demand for consistency, was simply the wrong tool to measure it. The law wanted a straight line, a clear motive, a direct path from thought to action, but life was a tangle, a knot of loose ends and half-formed desires that never quite coalesced until tragedy forced them into shape. He marked another discrepancy, and another. The red lines began to accumulate, a lattice of condemnation building up on the page. He was constructing the cage that would hold her, brick by red brick. His hand cramped. He dropped the pencil. It rolled off the desk and clattered onto the floor, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room. He did not bend to pick it up. He just sat there, staring at the smudged ink on his thumb, the red lines on the paper, the stack of letters that seemed to grow taller as he worked. The air in the room smelled of old paper, of tobacco smoke that had settled into the fabric of the chairs, of the damp wool of the coats hanging by the door. But underneath it all, he smelled something else, something metallic, something like the coppery tang of blood, or perhaps just the sharp, acidic bite of fear. He closed his eyes. For a second, he saw her, not the woman in the photograph, stern and composed, but the woman in the letters, frantic and alive, reaching out through the years, begging to be understood. "Fred, save me. Fred, I am so afraid." And he had answered, not with salvation, but with transcription. He opened his eyes. The headache had spread, wrapping around his skull like an iron band. He needed to stop. He needed to walk away, to leave the file unfinished, to let the machinery grind to a halt for just one night. But the clock on the wall ticked on, relentless, measuring out the seconds until the deadline, until the trial, until the end. He reached for the pencil. His hand shook slightly as he picked it up. He drew another line. The red mark looked fresh, wet, like a wound that had just been opened. He stared at it, waiting for the pain to stop, waiting for the doubt to recede. But it didn't. It just sat there, glaring up at him, a silent testament to the fact that sometimes the truth is not enough to save you, and sometimes the person who sees it clearly is the one most powerless to change it. He turned the page. The next statement waited, full of denials and half-truths, ready to be marked, ready to be used. He dipped the pen again, the ink well accepting the nib with a quiet, sucking sound. The scratch began anew, filling the silence, building the case, sealing the fate. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, a grey, suffocating wall that offered no escape, no view, no hope of anything beyond the room, the desk, the paper. He wrote on, the words flowing from his pen, each one a nail in the coffin, each mark a step closer to the gallows, and he knew, with a terrible, sinking clarity, that he would not stop until the job was done. The file was nearly full, and with only a few more pages left to cross-reference, he knew he would soon have to hand it over, to Wallinger, to the prosecution, to the judge, and to the jury, before finally surrendering it to the hangman. He finished the line and put the pencil down, its red tip worn blunt from use. When he looked at his hands, he saw they were stained with black ink and red dust. He wiped them on his trousers, but the marks remained. They would not come off, not today, not ever. He stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, a harsh, grating sound. He needed air. He needed to get out of this room before the walls closed in completely. He walked to the door, his steps heavy, and pushed it open. The corridor was dim, the gaslights flickering. He walked towards the stairs, towards the exit, towards the street. But he knew, even as he walked, that he would not find relief out there either. The fog was everywhere. It was in the streets, in the houses, in the courts, in the minds of the people. And it was in him. He reached the bottom of the stairs. The front door was ahead, freedom, fresh air, but he stopped. He turned around. He looked back up the stairs towards the room where the file lay waiting. He could not leave it, not yet. There was one more thing to check, one more discrepancy to mark, one more nail to drive home. He turned back and climbed the stairs, entering the room where he sat down to pick up the pencil. The scratch began again. The memo arrived not with a knock, but with a wet slap against the wood of his desk, delivered by a messenger boy whose cap dripped grey water onto the floorboards. Wallinger's handwriting scrawled across the top was sharp, angular, devoid of the looping sentimentality that filled Groom's own pages. Trial set. December. Expedite. 3 words. That was all it took to turn the mountain of paper on his blotter from a burden into a verdict. Groom stared at the note. The ink was still damp, smelling of fresh iron gall, a scent that suddenly felt violent in the stagnant air of the room. December. The month hung in his mind like a sentence passed before evidence was heard. It compressed the remaining weeks into something brittle, something that might snap under the weight of what he had to finish. He looked at the stack of transcribed letters, the onion-skin pages trembling slightly as a draft from the window found them. They were no longer just words on paper. They were the steps leading up to a trapdoor. He reached for the next envelope in the pile, the one marked Exhibit 42. His fingers, stained with the black smudge of his own labor, fumbled with the wax seal. It broke with a dry crack. Inside lay a letter from Frederick Bywaters, written from the docks in Singapore, the paper rougher, the script blockier than Edith's. My dearest love, I dream only of the day I hold you again. Simple, direct, deadly. Groom read the line, then he read it again. In the margin of the interrogation report beside it, he had already noted the date of arrival. It matched the timeline the prosecution was building, brick by logical brick. A sailor returns. A husband dies. The letters provide the motive. The law required a straight line, a clear trajectory from desire to destruction, and Groom was the man drawing that line in ink, so permanent it might as well be carved into stone. He picked up his pen. The nib felt cold against his skin. For a fleeting second, he imagined stopping, just laying the pen down and walking out of the room, leaving the file incomplete, the narrative unfinished. What would happen? They would find another clerk, someone younger perhaps, or someone harder, someone who did not see the trembling hand behind the word poison or hear the desperation in the plea for escape. Someone who would not flinch when copying the word glass and wondering if it meant a shard for a throat or a metaphor for a shattered life. The replacement would do the job cleaner, faster, without the hesitation that was slowing Groom's own hand to a crawl. He pressed the nib to the paper. The ink flowed, dark and inevitable. I dream only of the day. His hand moved, but his mind recoiled. He was not a witness. He had told himself that for weeks that he was merely a scribe, a neutral conduit for the facts. But a conduit carries the current, and if the current kills, the wire is part of the circuit. He was tightening the noose, one transcribed syllable at a time. Every word he committed to the official record stripped another layer of ambiguity from Edith's fevered imagination, turning her literary fantasies into concrete evidence of malice. The room seemed to shrink. The gaslight above buzzed, a low, insectal sound that drilled into the base of his skull. Around him, the other clerks worked on, their heads bowed, their pens scratching out the rhythms of other crimes, other tragedies. They did not look up. They did not see the ghost forming in the stack of papers on Groom's desk. To them, it was just work, just another file to be closed before the week was out. But Groom saw them, all 3 of them. He saw Percy Thompson, the husband, reduced to a plot point, a body on the pavement outside 41 Staines Road, whose only function now was to validate the anger in a lover's letter. He saw Frederick Bywaters, the sailor, whose simple devotion was being twisted into a conspiracy, his words weaponized against him. And he saw Edith, frantic and trapped, her voice echoing through these pages, begging for a salvation that would never come because the man hearing her cries was too busy writing them down to offer help. They were real, flesh and blood and fear, but in this room, under the green shade of the lamp, they were becoming caricatures, villains and victims, drawn in black and white, with no room for the grey, messy truth of unhappy marriages and dangerous dreams. Groom signed the bottom of the transcription page. A. Groom. The signature looked small, insignificant, a tiny mark against the overwhelming weight of the document, yet it was his. He had authenticated it. He had made it official. He blotted the page, the pink paper sucking up the excess ink, leaving a ghostly mirror of his work behind. The smell of the blotting powder, chalky and dry, filled his nose. He stacked the page on top of the others. The pile was complete. Silence rushed back into the room, heavier than before. It pressed against his ears, demanding he acknowledge what he had just done. He stood up, his knees cracked, a sharp sound in the quiet. He gathered the files, aligning the edges perfectly, tapping the stack on the desk until it formed a neat, deadly rectangle. He carried them to the cabinet in the corner, the heavy iron safe where the evidence was kept under lock and key. The key turned with a harsh, metallic click. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, final and absolute. Groom stood before the closed cabinet. His hand lingered on the cold metal handle. Inside, the letters waited. Soon they would be taken to the Old Bailey, placed before the judge, read aloud to a gallery of hungry spectators. They would be dissected, analyzed, used to justify a death. He reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against a folded sheet of paper, a copy he had made of one particular letter, the one where Edith spoke of the shadows lengthening over the gasworks. He had no right to have it. It was against every regulation, every rule of the yard. Possession of evidence was a dismissible offense, perhaps even criminal. He could burn it, right now, take it to the grate in the corner, toss it into the dying embers of the coal fire, and watch the truth turn to ash. It would change nothing for Edith or Fred. The official record was locked in the safe behind him, but it would cleanse his own hands, remove the complicity of holding onto a fragment of their humanity that the law refused to see. His thumb traced the edge of the paper in his pocket. The texture was rough, familiar. To burn it would be an act of mercy. To keep it was an act of defiance, or perhaps just cowardice, a way of hoarding a secret that offered no comfort. He withdrew his hand. The paper remained in his pocket, a heavy, burning weight against his thigh. Groom turned away from the cabinet. The room was dark now. The gaslight turned low, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. He walked to the window and looked out. The fog had thickened, swallowing the street below, erasing the world beyond the glass. There was no view, no escape, only the grey void pressing in. He placed his hand against the pane. The glass was cold, slick with condensation. On the other side, London marched on, indifferent to the files locked in the safe, indifferent to the fate of 3 people whose lives had been dismantled word by word. Tomorrow, the trial preparations would begin in earnest. The lawyers would arrive. The strategies would be formed. The machinery would engage its gears and begin to turn, grinding slowly, inexorably, towards December. Groom stepped back from the window. He straightened his tie, smoothed the lapels of his jacket. The motion was automatic, a reflex of a man returning to duty. He walked to the door, switched off the lamp, and plunged the room into darkness. He did not look back at the cabinet. He knew what was inside. He knew what it meant. He opened the door and stepped out into the corridor, the click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the silence. The long walk to the exit awaited, through the halls of power where justice was manufactured, but his hand remained in his pocket, clutching the stolen letter, the only truth he possessed in a world built on lies. The newsstand on the corner of Whitehall Place smelled of wet newsprint and burnt coffee, a sharp, acrid tang that caught in the back of Groom's throat before he had even stopped walking. He did not intend to buy anything. The half-crown in his pocket was earmarked for coal, not gossip. Yet his feet dragged him to the curb, drawn by the bold, black screaming of the headlines stacked in wooden crates, damp at the edges from the morning mist. ILFORD mystery, wife's shocking confessions, one banner read, the ink still glossy under the grey sky. Another, smaller but more vicious, promised poison plot revealed. Groom reached out, his gloved finger hovering over the pile, then snatched a copy of the Daily Mail as if the paper itself might bite him. He unfolded it there on the pavement, ignoring the jostle of clerks bound for the city rushing towards the underground, their umbrellas knocking against his elbows like hostile spears. The article butchered the letters. It took Edith's flowery, desperate fantasies about taking him away and making him sleep and stripped them of their context, presenting them as cold, calculated instructions for murder. The nuance was gone, the fear excised, leaving only a caricature of a wicked woman who plotted her husband's death over tea and scones. Groom felt a hot flush crawl up his neck, a physical reaction to the violation of something he knew to be intimate and fragile. These were not public property. They were the sweaty, tear-stained confessions of a trapped soul, written in the dead of night when the house was silent and the gasworks hummed in the distance. To see them flattened into column inches for the breakfast table made his stomach turn. He folded the paper sharply, creasing the spine with unnecessary force, and shoved it under his arm. The headline stared out from the fold, an accusing eye following him as he turned towards the yard. Inside, the atmosphere had thickened, the air heavy with the scent of stale tobacco smoke, and the damp wool of overcoats left to dry on radiators that clanked with irregular, metallic thuds. Groom hung his coat on the peg by the door, the fabric feeling heavier than usual, weighed down by the morning's reading. He walked to his desk, the floorboards creaking under his weight, a sound that seemed too loud in the hushed room where 3 other clerks were already hunched over their own stacks of paper, scratching away with insectile industry. Miller looked up as Groom sat, his face pale and drawn, eyes rimmed with red. "They're asking for you," Miller whispered, not looking directly at him, his gaze fixed on the blotter in front of him. "Wallinger, now," Groom nodded, a tight, jerky motion. He did not ask why. He knew. He stood up again, smoothing the front of his waistcoat, and walked towards the chief inspector's office. The door was ajar, revealing Wallinger standing by the window, staring out at the fog-choked river, his back to the room. He turned as Groom entered, his expression unreadable, a mask of bureaucratic calm that hid whatever pressure was being applied from above. "Groom," Wallinger said, his voice low, devoid of warmth. "The prosecution wants the timeline verified. Again. Specifically the dates in September. They say there are discrepancies in the transcription regarding the purchase of the acid." Groom felt a spike of irritation, sharp and sudden. "There are no discrepancies, sir. I transcribed what was written. The dates are clear in the original correspondence." Wallinger moved around the desk, leaning against the edge, crossing his arms. "It doesn't matter what is clear to you, Groom. It matters what they can use. They need absolute certainty. If there is any doubt, any gap, they will exploit it. Or worse, we will look incompetent. Go back over them, every entry, every mention of a date. Make sure it aligns perfectly with the shop receipts we have from Ilford." It was a command, but it felt like a threat. A subtle hint that the machinery was speeding up, demanding perfection to fuel the engine of the state. "Yes, sir," Groom said, the words tasting like ash. He turned and left the office, the weight of the request settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Back at his desk, the gaslight flickered, the supply fluctuating as the pressure in the mains dropped, casting dancing, grotesque shadows across the walls that seemed to stretch and warp with every pulse of the flame. Groom pulled the file towards him, the leather cover cold and slick under his palms. He opened it, the pages rustling loudly in the quiet room, and began to read. He traced the lines of Edith's handwriting with his eyes, the loops and flourishes that he had come to know so well, searching for the errors Wallinger had implied existed. There were none. The dates were consistent. The narrative was clear, but he knew that clarity was not what was required. They wanted confirmation, a rubber stamp of inevitability. He picked up his pen, the nib cold against his fingers, and began to check the entries against the receipts, a tedious, mind-numbing task that felt like a desecration. Outside, the distant wail of the factory whistle from barking cut through the fog, a mournful, lonely sound that marked the passing of another hour, another step closer to the trial. The sound seemed to vibrate in the floorboards, a reminder that time was marching on, indifferent to the struggles of a clerk in a dark room trying to find truth in a lie. He worked through the afternoon, the light fading until the green-shaded lamp was the only source of illumination, casting a pool of yellow glare on the desk, while the corners of the room receded into darkness. His eyes burned, dry and gritty, but he did not stop. He could not stop. The pressure from Wallinger, the sensationalism of the papers, the sheer momentum of the case pushed him forward, forcing him to validate the very evidence that would condemn the woman whose words he had internalized. Finally, late in the evening, he finished. He sat back, the chair groaning under his shifting weight, and looked at the verified file. It was perfect, flawless, a watertight container for a tragedy. He reached for the blotter, pressing it down on the final page to dry the fresh annotations, the smell of wet ink rising to meet him, sharp and chemical. He had done his job. He had ensured the case was solid, and in doing so, he felt as though he had just signed the warrant himself. The silence in the room was absolute now, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of a tap somewhere down the hall, a slow, maddening countdown that echoed the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Groom stared at the file, the black letters blurring slightly in the dim light, and wondered if Edith Thompson, wherever she was being held, could feel the weight of his pen pressing down on her fate from miles away. The summons arrived on a slip of buff paper, creased at the corners, ordering his attendance at the Ilford Petty Sessions, not as a witness to fact, but as a custodian of ink. He took the train from Liverpool Street, the carriage smelling of wet fur and coal dust, watching the city dissolve into the grey smear of the suburbs where the gasworks loomed like cathedral spires dedicated to a darker god. Ilford Station buzzed with a different energy than Whitehall. Here, the air tasted of roasted chestnuts and damp earth, and the crowds were not clerks in uniform, but spectators in Sunday best, craning necks for a glimpse of the monster. Groom kept his head down, the leather case containing the original letters strapped tight against his ribs, feeling the hard edges dig into his sternum with every jolt of the carriage. He was carrying a corpse in a box, or so it felt. The weight was disproportionate to the paper's mass. The courthouse was a brick box squeezed between a bakery and a chandler's shop, its windows fogged from the breath of too many bodies packed inside. He slipped in through a side door reserved for officials, bypassing the crush of reporters who were already sharpening their pencils like weapons. The room itself was a cavern of noise, a low, buzzing hum of conversation that stopped abruptly when the magistrates entered, their black robes rustling like dry leaves dragged over stone. Groom found a seat in the rear, near the radiator that clanked and hissed, releasing bursts of metallic heat that did little to cut the chills seeping up from the floorboards. He placed the case on his knees, hands resting on the lid, guarding it. Then she entered. Edith Thompson walked into the dock, not with the swagger of a femme fatale the papers described, but with the tentative shuffle of someone navigating a room in the dark. She wore a coat of heavy dark wool that seemed to swallow her frame, the collar turned up against the cold, and a hat pulled low over eyes that refused to meet the gaze of the gallery. Groom leaned forward, his breath catching in a throat suddenly too tight. She was smaller than the script suggested. The woman who had written of poisons and passionate escapes, who had filled pages with a vocabulary of desire and dread, looked fragile, almost breakable. Her face was pale, the skin translucent enough to show the blue tracery of veins beneath, but her expression was fixed, a mask of composed detachment that did not reach her eyes. Those eyes swept the room without seeing, fixed on a point on the far wall where a crack in the plaster ran like a lightning bolt from ceiling to skirting board. She was looking through the brick, through the crowd, perhaps all the way to the gasworks where the shadows lengthened as she had written. Exhibit 4, the prosecutor boomed, his voice bouncing off the high, bare walls, stripping the intimacy from the air. The correspondence dated September the 12th. A clerk passed the letters up to the bench. The magistrates handled them with gloved hands, turning the pages with a casual indifference that made Groom's stomach turn. They treated the sheets like receipts for stolen goods, discussing the loops of her Ys and the pressure of her pen strokes as if analyzing a forgery rather than a confession of the soul. One magistrate, a man with a moustache like a brush of wire, held a page up to the light, squinting at the mention of glass and powders. Clearly premeditated, the man muttered, loud enough for the front rows to hear. Specific instructions. Groom's fingers dug into the leather of the case. He wanted to stand. The urge rose in him, a hot, irrational spike of defiance that demanded he shout the truth, that these were fantasies, the desperate scribbles of a trapped woman trying to write herself out of a prison of boredom, not a blueprint for murder. He wanted to tell them that the ink was not blood, that the words were shields, not swords. His knuckles whitened, the tendons standing out like ropes on the back of his hand. He shifted in his seat, the wood creaking under his sudden tension. "Mr. Groom." The whisper came from the side. Miller, the constable who had escorted him, was watching him with a narrow, suspicious squint. "You're required to verify the chain of custody if asked. Don't look so bloody green. Sit still." Groom forced his shoulders down, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The moment passed, the opportunity to speak dissolving into the dry rustle of turning pages. He watched as the prosecutor quoted a line about doing away with him, his voice dripping with moral outrage, twisting the syntax until the meaning bent to fit the charge of murder. Edith did not flinch. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, fingers intertwining and separating in a rhythmic, nervous dance that only Groom, from his distance, seemed to notice. It was the same movement she described in her letters when she waited for the postman. A tiny, human tick amidst the legal theatre. The proceedings droned on, a relentless recitation of statutes and dates that buried the woman under the weight of the law. Groom listened to the voices overlapping, the prosecutor's boom, the magistrate's dry queries, the murmur of the crowd reacting to every salacious detail read aloud. It was a dissection. They were cutting her open, piece by piece, examining the entrails of her marriage for signs of malice, ignoring the context of fear and unhappiness that bled through every line. He felt a profound sense of violation, not just for Edith, but for himself. He knew these letters better than anyone. He had lived inside them for weeks, tracing the curve of her despair. Now they were being used to build a gallows. When the session adjourned for lunch, the room erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor, voices rose in a clamor of speculation, and the press surged forward, notebooks ready. Groom remained seated, clutching the case, waiting for the crowd to thin. He watched Edith being led out of the dock by two warders. She moved slowly, her head still down, stepping carefully over the threshold as if it were a tripwire. For a second, as she passed the row where he sat, she lifted her head. Her gaze swept across the back of the room, devoid of hope, filled with a deep, resonant terror that seemed to suck the air from the space around her. Their eyes met. It lasted less than a heartbeat. She did not recognize him. He was just another shadow in the crowd, another functionary in the machine grinding her down. But in that fleeting connection, Groom felt the full, crushing weight of her humanity. She was not a villain. She was a frightened woman who had written too much and too honestly in a world that forgave men everything and women nothing. The warder tugged her sleeve, urging her forward, and she dropped her gaze again, retreating into the shell she had built to survive the ordeal. Groom sat alone as the room emptied, the silence rushing back in to fill the void left by the crowd. The smell of the place lingered, old wood, dust, and the sharp, chemical tang of the disinfectant used on the dock rails. He looked down at the leather case on his knees. Inside lay the proof of her life, now weaponized against her. He had verified the dates. He had confirmed the handwriting. He had made the case watertight. The realization settled in his gut like a stone, cold and immovable. There was no saving her from the words she had written, and there was no saving himself from the knowledge that he had helped sharpen the knife. He stood up, his legs stiff, and walked towards the exit, the case heavy in his hand, stepping out into the grey afternoon where the fog was already beginning to roll in from the Thames, ready to swallow the court, the town, and the truth alike. The real trial was yet to come, and he would be there, pen in hand, watching the ink turn to rope. Dust motes swam in the shafts of weak light piercing the high windows, swirling above the dark wood of the Old Bailey like ash from a fire that had long since burned out. The smell hit Groom first, not the fresh ink of Scotland Yard, but the stale, accumulated odor of centuries, polished oak, damp horsehair, and the sour breath of men waiting for blood. He sat on the hard bench reserved for clerks, his spine rigid against the backrest, fingers tracing the grain of the railing until a splinter caught on his thumbnail. Pain sharpened the fog in his head. Morning had brought no relief from the grey dampness of the city. The fog outside remained a solid wall pressing against the glass, but inside the court the air was still, suffocatingly so. Groom shifted his weight. The wood creaked, a sharp crack that drew a sideways glare from the usher standing by the door. He froze, breath held. The usher looked away, bored, returning his stare to the empty dock. Empty for now. Sir Archibald Bodkin stood at the centre of the well, adjusting the papers on the lectern. He wore heavy black robes that swallowed the light, his face pale and narrow under the gas lamps. When he spoke, his voice did not boom, it cut, precise, cold. Each word dropped into the silence like a stone into a deep well, waiting for the echo to confirm the kill. The Crown alleges premeditation, Bodkin said. He paused, letting the words settle on the jury box. Not a crime of passion, committed in the heat of the moment, but a conspiracy hatched in the privacy of a suburban home. Groom's hand twitched towards his pocket. The habit was ingrained, a muscle memory from weeks of transcription. He wanted a pen. He wanted to write down the date, the time, the specific turn of phrase. But here he was not a scribe. He was a witness, a ghost in the machinery. Bodkin lifted a sheet of paper, onion skin, thin enough to see the shadow of the writing through the back. Groom knew that paper. He had held it. He had smoothed the creases where Edith Thompson's hand had trembled. "Exhibit 1, Bodkin said. He turned to the jury, holding the paper up as if it were a relic of a saint's bone. Written by the accused woman to the co-accused. Dated September 1921. I am going to try and poison him." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Heads turned. Whispers collided with the rustle of programs. Groom flinched. The words sounded different here. In the quiet of the record room, they had felt like cries of despair, the frantic scribbles of a trapped woman dreaming of escape. Spoken aloud in this cavern of stone, they became bricks, mortar, a wall closing in. "She does not mean it," Groom whispered. He didn't know he had said it until the air left his lips. Miller was beside him. The constable had not moved an inch since the session began, his hands folded on his lap, eyes fixed on Bodkin. He didn't turn his head. "Speak up, Groom," Miller said. His voice was low, a gravelly scrape. "Or keep it shut. The judge has ears like a bat." "She wrote it in fear," Groom said. He kept his voice down, aiming it at the wood of the bench. "She was unhappy, the marriage was." "None of that matters," Miller cut in. He finally turned, his eyes narrow slits in a fleshy face. "Words are words, Arthur. Once they're on paper, they belong to whoever holds the pen. And right now, Bodkin holds the pen." Groom swallowed. The taste of copper filled his mouth. He looked back at Bodkin, who was now pacing the well, the paper still in his hand. The prosecutor moved with the confidence of a man who knows the path is already cleared. He stopped before the dock, though it remained empty. He was setting the stage. "There are more," Bodkin said. He shuffled the pages. The sound was dry, like leaves skittering on pavement. References to powders, to glass, to doing away with the husband so that the lover might take his place. The prosecution will demonstrate that these were not fantasies, they were instructions. Groom's fingers dug into his palms. He could feel the phantom stain of ink on his skin, the indelible mark of his own complicity. He had transcribed those lines. He had deciphered the hurried scrawl where the nib had torn the paper. He had seen the blots where a tear might have fallen, smudging the threat into a plea. But tears did not survive the copying process. Only the words remained, hardened, absolute. The light in the room seemed to dim as a cloud passed over the sun outside. Shadows lengthened across the floor, creeping towards the dock like dark water. Groom watched the dust motes again. They danced in the gloom, indifferent to the life hanging in the balance. He thought of the record room at Scotland Yard. The silence there was different. It was a waiting silence. Here, the silence was final. It was the silence of a door locking. "Consider the timeline," Bodkin continued. He tapped the lectern with a forefinger. Tap, tap. The letters cease abruptly after the incident on the pavement. Why? Because the plan had been executed, because the writer had nothing left to say. "It isn't true," Groom said. He couldn't stop himself. The words tore out of him, louder this time. Miller shifted. His hand moved towards his belt, not for a weapon, but to adjust the weight of it. A warning. "Sit still," he hissed. "You want to be thrown out? You want to leave her alone in there?" Groom clenched his jaw. The muscle jumped. He looked at the dock. The wood was scarred, scratched by the nails of men who had stood there before, men who had walked out to the gallows in the yard behind the walls. He knew the route. He had mapped it in his head while transcribing the dates, from the dock to the holding cell, from the cell to the scaffold, a straight line. Bodkin placed the paper down. He smoothed it with both hands, a gesture of finality. "We will call the woman to the stand," he said, "and we will ask her to explain these words to you in her own voice." The usher moved. He walked to the side door and opened it. The hinges groaned, a long, mournful sound that echoed off the stone walls. Everyone turned. The gallery leaned forward, heads craned. Groom stopped breathing. Edith Thompson entered. She wore black, a severe dress that hung loosely on her frame. Her face was pale, stripped of color, but her eyes were wide, sweeping the room with a frantic, animal intensity. She did not look at the judge. She did not look at the jury. She looked at the floor, watching her feet as she walked, placing one step in front of the other as if the ground might give way. She reached the dock. She climbed the steps. Her hand gripped the rail, the knuckles white against the dark wood. She turned to face the court. For a second, her gaze swept the room. It passed over the jury. It passed over Bodkin. It passed over Groom. She did not see him. He was part of the furniture, part of the machine. She stood there waiting. The silence in the room was absolute now. No coughing, no rustling, just the sound of her breathing, shallow and rapid, carrying further than it should have in the stillness. Bodkin picked up his pen. He dipped it into the inkwell. The scratch of the nib on the paper sounded like a bone breaking. Groom watched her hands. They were trembling, just slightly, a vibration that ran through her fingers and into the wood. He knew that tremor. He had seen it in the loops of her handwriting, the way the letters leaned on each other for support. She was afraid, not of the court, not of the law, but of the words she had written, the words he had copied, the words that were now about to be read back to her as a sentence of death. Bodkin cleared his throat. He looked up at her. "Mrs. Thompson," he said. His voice was gentle now, deceptive. "Would you tell the court about the letter dated the 16th of October?" Edith opened her mouth. No sound came out. She swallowed. She tried again. Her voice cracked. She gripped the rail tighter. "I don't remember." "You don't remember?" Bodkin tilted his head. "You wrote it. You signed it. Surely you remember the ink." Groom looked down at his own hands. They were clean. He had washed them before coming to court, but he could still smell the iron gall. It was under his skin, in his blood. He looked back at Edith. She was staring at Bodkin, her chest heaving. She was drowning, and he was holding the anchor. The usher stepped closer to her, a silent threat. "Stand straight, speak up." Groom leaned forward. The bench groaned under his weight. He needed to speak. He needed to say something. But what? The truth was irrelevant here. The truth had no place in the dock. Only the evidence mattered, and he had verified the evidence. Bodkin waited. The pen hovered over the paper. A black drop of ink swelled at the nib, grew heavy and fell. A single spot of darkness on the white page. It spread. It bloomed. Edith closed her eyes. She took a breath. She opened them. "It was a story," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried. "Just a story." Bodkin smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "We shall see," he said. He turned to the jury. "Let the record show that the accused claims her intentions were fictional." Groom sat back. The wood felt cold against his spine. He watched the ink spot on Bodkin's paper dry. It turned from wet black to a dull, matte gray, like ash, like the fog outside, like the future. The clerk next to him began to write. The scratch of the pen filled the room. Scritch, scritch, a rhythm, a countdown. Groom listened to it. He counted the strokes. One for every year she had been married, one for every letter she had written, one for every step to the gallows. He looked at Edith. She was still holding the rail. Her knuckles were white. Her eyes were fixed on Bodkin. She was waiting for the next question, the next trap. Groom reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the notebook he had brought. He pulled it out. He opened it. The pages were blank. He picked up his pen. He uncapped it. He touched the nib to the paper. He did not write. He couldn't. The ink wouldn't flow. Bodkin spoke again. "Mrs. Thompson, did you not write to Frederick Bywaters about obtaining poison?" Edith flinched. The movement was small, a twitch of the shoulder, but Groom saw it. He saw the way her breath hitched. He saw the way her eyes darted to the side, looking for an escape that wasn't there. She stopped. She looked at the jury. They were watching her, unblinking. "I read about it in a book." "In a book," Bodkin repeated. He wrote it down. "And you thought it would make an interesting story for your lover?" "Yes," she said, too quickly. "Yes." Bodkin nodded. He looked at the judge. The judge nodded back. Groom put the pen down. He closed the notebook. He pushed it away. It slid across the wood. It hit the edge. It stopped. He looked at Edith. She was alone, surrounded by men, surrounded by laws, surrounded by words she could not take back. The clerk next to him turned a page. The sound was loud, like a sheet being pulled over a face. Groom stood up. He couldn't sit anymore. The air was too thick. He needed to breathe. He stepped back from the bench. Miller looked at him. "Sit down," Miller said. "I need air," Groom said. "Not now," Miller said. "Wait for the adjournment." Groom sat down. He folded his hands. He looked at the dock. Edith was speaking again. He couldn't hear the words. They were muffled by the ringing in his ears. He watched her lips move. He watched the hands gesture. He watched the life drain out of her with every sentence. The ink spot on Bodkin's paper was dry now. It was part of the page, permanent. Groom closed his eyes. He saw the letters. He saw the loops. He saw the blots. He saw the blood on the pavement in Ilford. He opened his eyes. Edith was looking at him, really looking at him. This time, she knew him. She knew what he had done. She didn't look away. She held his gaze. Her eyes were dry, hard, accusing. Groom looked down. He looked at his hands. They were shaking, just like hers. The clerk next to him wrote another word, scritch. Groom counted the stroke, 1. He waited for the next. The name hung in the stale air, a ghost summoned without a S.A. copyright ants. Frederick Bywaters, not present in the flesh, for his trial sat on a separate docket, a parallel track of justice converging only in the shared catastrophe of this courtroom, yet his absence felt heavier than the oak paneling, more suffocating than the coal smoke drifting through the vents. Bodkin turned from Edith, pivoting on his heel with the crisp efficiency of a man who knows the ground beneath him is solid, unshakable law. He held up a sheet of paper. It was not Edith's flowing, looped script, the handwriting of a woman who tried to make her longing look like art. This was jagged, sharp. The pen had been pressed hard, indenting the fiber, a sailor's hand accustomed to rigging and rope, not the delicate negotiation of suburbia. Exhibit 42, Bodkin announced. The words dropped like stones into a well. A letter from the accused Frederick Bywaters to the prisoner at the bar. Groom stiffened. He knew this one. He had transcribed it 3 weeks ago in the silence of the record room, the smell of damp wool from his own coat mixing with the scent of the ink. He remembered the specific phrasing, the way Fred had written about the way out, the desperate, clumsy planning of a young man who saw no other door open but the one marked with violence. In the quiet of the office, it had read like a tragedy waiting to happen, a cry of frustration from a boy trapped by age and class. Here, under the glare of the gas jets, it sounded like a blueprint. "Read the third paragraph, Mrs. Thompson," Bodkin said. He did not shout. He did not need to. The acoustics of the Old Bailey carried every syllable to the furthest corner, amplifying the intimacy of the betrayal. The part regarding the return from the theatre. Edith turned her head slightly, just enough to see the paper in Bodkin's hand, but not enough to look at the jury. Her profile was stark against the grey light filtering from the high windows, the line of her jaw set so hard it looked painful. She said nothing. Her throat worked, a small, bird-like movement of swallowing a scream or perhaps a denial that had lost its shape before it could be spoken. "I will read it," Bodkin offered, his tone almost helpful, a teacher guiding a slow pupil. "I will do it tonight, Eddie. No more waiting. If he is there, I shall finish it. You must be ready." He paused, letting the words settle into the woodwork, into the clothes of the spectators, into the marrow of the 12 men who would decide if a woman could be hanged for the words of her lover. "Does that sound like a story, Mrs. Thompson? Does that sound like fiction?" It was. He was angry, Edith whispered. The sound was thin, brittle as dried leaf. He was a sailor. They speak like that. It is their way. Their way. Bodkin stepped closer to the dock. The leather of his shoes squeaked, a sharp, intrusive noise in the hush. Is it the sailor's way to discuss the administration of poison? Is it the custom of the merchant navy to plan stabbings on the pavement outside one's own home? Groom's fingers curled into his palms. He could feel the phantom pressure of the pen he had used to copy those very words, the friction of the nib dragging across Thes 2 Cisadilla 3 paper. He remembered thinking, even then, that Fred's letters lacked the nuance of Edith's, that they were blunt instruments compared to her scalpel. But blunt instruments kill just as dead, perhaps more efficiently. The prosecution was weaving them together now, taking the thread of Edith's fantasy and the knot of Fred's intent, braiding them into a noose that tightened with every citation. They were not two separate people anymore. In the eyes of the court, they were a single entity of malice, a hydra of adultery and murder. "He loved me," Edith said. The words tumbled out, desperate, unbidden. "He only wanted to free us." "Free you," Bodkin's voice sharpened, losing its pedagogical warmth. "By cutting the throat of your husband, By dragging him bleeding onto the steps of 41 Staines Road, he turned to the jury, spreading his hands as if presenting a gift. This is the freedom she sought, a freedom purchased with blood. Groom looked away. He could not watch her face anymore. The accusation in her eyes earlier had been replaced by a hollowed-out despair, a vacancy that terrified him more than her anger. He focused instead on the clerk next to him, a young man named Holloway who was scratching away at his notebook with vigorous, unthinking strokes. Holloway did not know the weight of the words he was recording. To him, this was just another day, another file, another set of dates to be logged before lunch. He wrote Poison and Theatre, and finished it with the same casual indifference with which he might note the delivery of coal or the time of the adjournment. The disparity made Groom's stomach turn. Here was the machinery of the state grinding forward with impeccable, soulless precision. It did not care about the unhappiness of a marriage in Ilford. It did not care about the suffocating boredom of a suburban wife or the restless ambition of a young sailor. It cared only about the sequence of events, the causality established by ink on paper. Groom had fed the machine. He had taken the raw, messy human emotion of those letters, stripped them of their context, their heat, their desperate hope, and rendered them into clean, legible evidence. He had made it easy for Bodkin. He had made it easy for the jury. "Did you not encourage him?" Bodkin pressed. He was relentless now, sensing the kill. "Did you not write back, telling him how it might be done, suggesting the methods?" "No," Edith said. She gripped the rail again, her knuckles white, the skin stretched tight over the bone. "I told him no. I told him to stop." "And yet he did not stop," Bodkin countered. "And yet, when the time came, you were there, walking arm in arm, returning to the scene. Is that the behavior of a woman who wishes to stop her lover, or is it the behavior of an accomplice?" The question hung there, unanswered. Edith sank back slightly, her shoulders slumping as if the physical weight of the accusation had finally bowed her spine. She looked small, frail, a woman who had tried to write herself into a different life and found instead that she had written her own warrant of execution. Groom felt a sudden, sharp urge to stand, to shout that it was more complicated, that people were not just the sum of their worst sentences, that love and fear could coexist in the same heart without necessarily birthing murder. But he sat still. His feet felt nailed to the floor. The rules of the court, the unwritten laws of his profession, held him in place as effectively as any shackle. He was a witness, a scribe, nothing more. To speak would be to contaminate the record, to introduce the very subjectivity he was paid to excise. He looked down at his own notebook. The page was blank save for the date at the top. 8 December 1922. The ink was dry. The words were already written elsewhere in the files, in the transcripts, in the minds of the jury. His hand twitched, reaching for the pen, but he stopped himself. What was there to write? The truth was already dead, buried under Thea Cisadilla section of exhibits and the rhetorical flourishes of the prosecution. Bodkin was speaking again, moving on to the next letter, the next date, the next piece of the puzzle that fit together too perfectly. He spoke of glass, of powders, of letters hidden under petticoats. Each word was a hammer blow, driving another nail into the coffin of Edith Thompson's defense. And through it all, the ghost of Frederick Bywaters loomed, his direct, unadorned letters serving as the brutal counterpoint to Edith's flowery evasions. They completed each other. The prosecution had ensured that. Groom closed his eyes for a second, just a second, blocking out the sight of Edith shrinking in the dock, the sight of Bodkin gesturing with the lethal papers. He could hear the scratching of Holloway's pen beside him, a steady, rhythmic sound that seemed to mock the chaos of the human spirit being dismantled before them. Scritch, scritch. It was the sound of time passing, of history being recorded, of a life being reduced to a case file. When he opened his eyes, Bodkin was sitting down. The judge was making a note. The usher was shifting his weight. The court moved on, indifferent to the wreckage left in its wake. Edith remained standing, alone in the dock, staring at nothing. Groom picked up his pen. He had to write. It was his job. He touched the nib to the paper, the cold metal a shock against his skin, and began to transcribe the next line of the indictment, his handwriting neat, precise, and utterly devoid of mercy. The ink flowed smoothly, black and final, marking another step towards the inevitable end. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the streets of London, hiding the world from itself. But inside, everything was painfully, brutally clear. The fog pressed against the high windows of the office like a living thing. It muffled the distant rumble of omnibuses on the Strand. Groom felt the chills seeping through the glass and into his bones. He stared at the stack of letters before him. They were tied with a simple piece of twine, now frayed and dirty. Edith Thompson's handwriting danced across the pages in a frantic, looping script. It was a stark contrast to the rigid columns of the ledger beside his elbow. The ink smelled sharp and chemical, a scent that clung to the back of the throat. Wallinger stood by the fireplace, though no fire burned there today. The grate held only a pile of cold ash and a discarded matchstick. He turned slowly, his face grey in the gloom of the afternoon. His eyes were hard, devoid of any sympathy for the writer or the reader. "Do not mistake drama for innocence, Groom," he said quietly. "A woman who writes of death so often invites it into her home." Groom looked down at the open letter. The words seemed to shimmer under the gaslight. "I wish he were dead," she had written. The sentence sat there, naked and terrible. It was not a metaphor in this light. It was a confession waiting to be claimed. He felt a sudden nausea rise in his stomach. The room felt too small, the air too thick with the smoke of 100 cigarettes. He wanted to push the papers away. He wanted to walk out into the fog and let it swallow him whole. "But she never acted, sir," Groom whispered. His voice sounded thin in the heavy silence. "She wrote of poisons she did not buy. She spoke of blades she never held." Wallinger stepped closer. His boots made no sound on the worn linoleum floor. He leaned over the desk, his shadow falling across the evidence. "The law does not concern itself with what she did not do," he replied. "It concerns itself with what she wanted. Desire is the seed of the act. These letters are the water that fed it." Groom picked up his pen again. The nib hovered over the blank page of his notebook. He could not make it move. The weight of the coming winter seemed to press down on his shoulders. Outside, a church bell told the hour, the sound dull and distorted by the mist. It was 4 o'clock. The light was already failing. Soon the lamps would be lit along the embankment, casting long, wavering reflections on the black water of the Thames. "She loved the story more than the man," Wallinger observed. His finger traced the edge of a page. "She cast herself as the heroine of a tragedy. She forgot that real tragedies end in the gallows, not in a chapter." Groom flinched at the word, the gallows. It hung in the air between them, invisible but heavy. He thought of Edith in the dock. He remembered the way her hands had trembled as she adjusted her gloves. She had looked so small, so utterly lost. Now she was reduced to these sheets of paper, analyzed and dissected for malice. The humanity was being drained from her, drop by drop, just as the ink drained from his pot. "The jury will see it as you say, sir," Groom admitted. His hand finally moved, scratching a single line onto the paper. The sound was harsh in the quiet room. "They will see a plot where there was only fantasy." "Fantasy is a luxury we cannot afford in a murder trial," Wallinger said. He straightened his jacket. The fabric rustled softly. "Find the intent, Groom. Connect the dream to the deed. That is your task." Groom nodded again. The movement was mechanical, devoid of will. He dipped the pen once more. The red ink welled up, dark and viscous. It looked disturbingly like blood against the white porcelain of the pot. He touched it to the page and began to write. He wrote of shadows and poison. He wrote of a woman's desperate longing for escape. He twisted her words until they formed a noose. The fog outside grew denser, blotting out the view of the street entirely. The world beyond the window ceased to exist. There was only this room, this desk, and the terrible task at hand. The clock on the mantel ticked with a steady, indifferent rhythm. Each second marked a step closer to the end. Groom did not look up. He could not bear to see the grey light fading. He focused only on the flow of the ink. It moved smoothly, betraying no hesitation, no mercy. Wallinger watched him for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked towards the door. His hand rested on the brass handle. "Have it on my desk by morning," he commanded. His voice was final. "The director expects results." The door clicked shut. The latch engaged with a sharp snap. Groom was alone. The silence rushed back in to fill the space. It pressed against his ears, heavy and suffocating. He continued to write. The words piled up on the page, building a wall between him and his conscience. He told himself it was just a job. He told himself he was merely a scribe. But the ink knew better. It flowed black and final, sealing a fate that had perhaps been written long before the first letter was pennied. The gaslight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall. They looked like figures hanging from a beam. Groom blinked them away. He had to finish. The night was coming, and there was still so much to transcribe. Wallinger's finger tapped the paper, a dry, percussive sound that stopped Groom's breath in his throat. "Highlight the intent," the chief inspector said. His voice was flat, stripped of curiosity, the tone of a man ordering coal or filing a tax return. "We are not here to critique her prose style, Groom. We are here to build a case." Groom nodded, though the motion felt stiff, as if his neck joints had rusted overnight. He reached for the red pot, the glass cool against his palm, and dipped the nib. The ink bloomed thick and arterial on the blotter before he touched it to the page. "Premeditation," Wallinger repeated, tasting the word like sour milk. "The prosecution needs a thread, a single, unbroken line from these fanciful scribbles to the knife in Percy Thompson's side. Find it." "I see only metaphors, sir," Groom said. The words slipped out before he could clamp his jaw shut. "She speaks of shadows, of poison in the tea, but it reads like a novel, a cheap romance serial." Wallinger leaned closer. The smell of him hit Groom first, stale pipe tobacco, wet wool, and the sharp, acidic tang of sweat that had dried on a collar worn too many days. It was the scent of a man who worked in rooms without windows. "Metaphors kill men in the Old Bailey," Wallinger said. He straightened up, his shadow retreating from the desk, but leaving a cold patch on the wood where his hand had rested. "A jury does not care for the nuances of a woman's imagination. They care for facts. If she wrote poison, she meant poison. If she wrote knife, she meant steel. Your job is to make sure the connection is visible. Underline it, box it, make it impossible for 12 good men to miss." Groom looked down at the letter. The handwriting was looping, frantic, the ink varying from a deep, confident black to a watery gray where the nib had scraped dry. "I wish he were dead," Edith Thompson had written on a Tuesday in August. "I would do anything to be free." In the context of an unhappy marriage, it was a cry of despair. In the context of a murder trial, it was a confession. "She mentions the gasworks," Groom murmured, tracing the line with a finger that trembled slightly. "She says the smoke chokes her, that it tastes of sulfur and death." "Exactly," Wallinger said. He turned to leave, his boots clicking on the linoleum, a sharp, rhythmic counterpoint to the scratching of the other clerks. "The gasworks, where Fred Bywaters worked, where the chemicals were stored. She is placing him at the scene of the crime through association. It is circumstantial, yes, but pile enough circumstantial bricks and you build a wall no defense can climb." "But she never mentions Fred by name in this passage," Groom said. He looked up, seeking some flicker of doubt in the chief inspector's eyes, some recognition of the desperate fiction unfolding on the page. "She speaks of a lover, a shadow. It could be anyone. It could be no one." Wallinger paused at the door. He did not turn around immediately. He adjusted his cuff, a precise, fussy movement that suggested he found the air in the room contaminated. "It is whoever we say it is, Groom," he said, his back still to the desk. "Once we write it in the indictment, it becomes truth. The ink dries and the story hardens. Do not confuse your sympathy with accuracy. Transcribe the words, mark the threats, leave the interpretation to the Crown." The door clicked shut, the latch engaged with a finality that echoed in the high, dusty room. Groom sat alone with the letters. The green shade of the lamp cast a pool of sickly light over the desk, leaving the corners of the room in deep, impenetrable shadow. He could hear the other clerks working around him, the dry rustle of paper, the occasional cough, the scrape of a chair leg, but they sounded distant, as if he was submerged underwater while they walked on the surface. He dipped the pen again. The red ink waited, a small pool of potential violence in the well of the nib. "If only you would do something," Edith had written. "If only something would happen to stop it all." Groom hovered the pen over the word something. To underline it was to accuse. To leave it plain was to ignore his orders. The weight of the decision pressed against his temples, a dull, throbbing ache that had nothing to do with the coal smoke outside. He thought of Percy Thompson, lying on the pavement in Ilford, the blood soaking into his collar, the life leaking out of him while his wife watched. He thought of the way the newspapers would scream tomorrow, how they would twist these flowery, desperate sentences into a map of cold-blooded calculation. He lowered the pen. The red tip touched the paper. A line appeared under something, then another under "Stop it all." The ink bled into the fibers of the page, spreading slightly, blurring the edge of the letters. It looked like a wound. Groom wiped his fingers on his trousers, leaving a faint, rusty smear on the grey wool. He reached for the next sheet, his hand moving with a mechanical rhythm that felt detached from his will. The letters piled up, a tower of testimony built from the wreckage of a marriage, each page a brick in the gallows he was helping to construct. Outside, the fog thickened against the windowpane, pressing in as if trying to read the words over his shoulder. Somewhere in the distance, a factory siren wailed, a long, mournful note that signaled the end of the shift at the gasworks. Men would be walking home now, wiping grease from their hands, thinking of supper, of warm fires, of wives who waited with clean shirts and quiet words. They did not know about this room. They did not know that their letters, their secrets, their foolish fantasies were being dissected under this green light, stripped of their humanity and rearranged into evidence of murder. Groom turned the page. The next letter was dated September. The handwriting was shakier, the lines less controlled. "I am afraid," it began. "I am so terribly afraid." He picked up the red pen. His hand did not shake this time. The line he drew was straight, precise, and utterly damning. The ink flowed, binding her fear to the crime, turning a tremor of conscience into a proof of guilt. Groom watched the red line dry, glossy and dark, and felt the cold smoothness of the nib scrape against the rough bond one last time before he set the pen down. The stack of untranscribed letters waited. It was a tall pile, leaning slightly to the left, casting a long, jagged shadow across the desk that seemed to reach for his wrist, pulling him deeper into the work, deeper into the dark, inescapable logic of the law. He reached for the top sheet. The paper crinkled under his touch, dry and brittle as a dead leaf. The paper crinkled, a dry snap that sounded like a bone breaking in a quiet room. "Dearest Fred," the new page began. The ink here was different, a watery blue that had soaked through to the reverse side, blooming in the fibers like a bruise. Groom squinted against the green glare of the lamp, his eyes gritty from hours of staring at the same slanted hand. The smell of the letter rose up again, that cloying lavender water mixed with something sharper, the metallic tang of fierce sweat absorbed into the pulp. He read the first line aloud, a whisper that barely disturbed the dust motes dancing above his desk. "They are watching the house." A clerk 2 desks over, a man named Miller with a mustache stiffened by pomade, looked up. He did not speak. He merely adjusted his spectacles, the glass catching the light and flashing a brief, warning white before he returned to his own stack of dockets. The message was clear. Silence was the currency of this room. Speech was an overdraft no one could afford. Groom swallowed. His throat felt lined with wool. He dipped the pen into the red well, the nib hovering over the word "watching." To underline it was to suggest surveillance, to imply a consciousness of guilt that transformed a paranoid wife into a conspirator. If she knew they were watching, she knew she had done wrong. If she knew she had done wrong, the premeditation held. The logic was a trap, sprung by a single stroke of crimson. He drew the line. It wavered, just slightly, a microscopic tremor that betrayed the fatigue in his wrist. "I have put the powder in his tea," Edith had written further down the page, the script tightening as the sentence progressed, the loops of the P and G becoming sharp, jagged things. But my hand shook. I could not do it. I poured it down the sink. Groom stopped. The pen hovered, a drop of red ink gathering at the tip, swollen and heavy, threatening to fall and ruin the evidence below. This was the exculpatory clause, the retraction, the admission of fantasy over action. In the raw, unfiltered chaos of a marriage suffocating under the weight of duty and boredom, this was a woman screaming into the void, testing the boundaries of her own courage and finding them wanting. She had confessed to the thought, yes, but she had also confessed to the failure of the act. Wallinger's voice echoed in his head, flat and devoid of nuance. "Mark the threats, leave the interpretation to the Crown." If he underlined the first sentence, the jury would see a poisoner. If he ignored the second, they would never know the poison had gone down the sink. The narrative would harden around the accusation, leaving the exoneration buried in the fine print of a transcript no one would read but him. The drop of ink fell. It landed on the margin, a small, perfect sphere of blood red that slowly flattened, eating into the paper. Groom stared at it, hypnotized by the slow, inevitable spread. It was a mistake, a clerical error. He could blot it, claim a slip of the hand. But the stain remained, a tiny, accusing eye staring back at him. He moved the pen to the text. He underlined, "I have put the powder in his tea." The line was bold, aggressive, a slash of violence across the page. Then he moved to the next sentence, but my hand shook. His hand trembled now, mirroring hers across the gulf of 2 months and a chasm of legal procedure. He hesitated. The silence in the room pressed against his eardrums, heavy and physical, a weight that made it hard to draw breath. Miller was typing again, the clack-clack-clack of the keys sounding like hammer strikes on an anvil. Groom lifted the pen. He did not underline the retraction. He left the words plain, unadorned, lost in the sea of black script where the red marks of guilt stood out like signposts in a fog. They would be read, technically. They would be entered into the record, but they would not be highlighted. They would not be read aloud by the prosecutor with the booming, theatrical cadence that turned suspicion into certainty. They would be silence within the noise. A cold draft seeped through the sash window, raising gooseflesh on his forearms beneath the cheap wool of his shirt. He shivered, a violent, involuntary jerk that rattled the inkwell. The red liquid rippled, distorting his reflection in the dark pool. He looked gaunt, ghostly, a man already half erased by the work he was doing. He turned the page. The next letter was shorter, written on the back of a grocery list. The handwriting was frantic, the letters sprawling off the lines, crashing into the margins like a vehicle losing control on a wet road. "He suspects," it read. "He looked at the cup. He asked why the tea tasted bitter. I told him it was the water. Fred, I am drowning." Groom's stomach turned, a slow, sickening roll that had nothing to do with hunger. He could taste the bitterness in his own mouth, a phantom flavor of arsenic or antimony, whatever powder she had bought from the chemist in Ilford. It coated his tongue, dry and chalky. He reached for the red pen again. The movement was automatic now, a reflex conditioned by the rhythm of the room, the expectation of the state. Find the threat, mark the intent, build the wall. But his fingers refused to close around the barrel. They sat on the desk, pale and stiff, the nails bitten down to the quick. "Problem, Groom." Miller's voice cut through the haze, sharp and unexpected. Groom jumped, his elbow knocking the stack of letters. They slid, threatening to topple, but he caught them just in time, his fingers digging into the cheap paper. "No," Groom said. His voice sounded rough, unused, just a smudge. "Keep moving," Miller muttered, not looking up from his typewriter. "Wallinger wants the bundle by 6. The briefing is at the Old Bailey tomorrow morning. They need the exhibits numbered." "Yes," Groom picked up the pen. The weight of it felt alien in his hand, like holding a weapon he didn't know how to fire. 6 o'clock. He looked back at the page. He asked why the tea tasted bitter. If he underlined this, it proved Percy Thompson's suspicion, reinforcing the idea of a domestic war zone. It painted Edith as a cornered animal, dangerous and desperate. It fit the narrative of the wife who poisons the husband to clear the way for the lover. It was the perfect brick for the prosecution's wall. He drew the line, red against black, guilt against innocence. The ink flowed smoothly, no hesitation this time. The machine inside him had engaged, grinding past the friction of conscience, driven by the sheer momentum of the procedure. He marked the next sentence, and the next. He highlighted the references to sleeping drafts and broken glass and accidents on the stairs, stripping them of their context as marital arguments or hyperbolic venting, forging them instead into a chain of premeditated attempts. By the time he reached the bottom of the page, his hand was cramped, the muscles in his forearm burning with a dull, persistent ache. The letter was a roadmap of crimson, a trail of blood leading from Ilford to the gallows. He set the pen down. The nib clicked against the glass inkwell, a small, final sound. Groom leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, seeing stars burst behind his eyelids, purple and gold against the black. When he opened them, the letters were still there. The red lines still stared up at him, accusatory and absolute. He reached for the next sheet. It was different, thicker paper, cream-colored, not the usual cheap onion skin, and it wasn't from Edith. The handwriting was blocky, masculine, the loops tight and controlled. It bore the address of a solicitor's office in the city, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Frederick Bywaters. Groom froze. The correspondence files were supposed to be one way, the intercepted letters from the wife to the lover seized from the house in Staines Road. Bywaters was in custody. He wasn't writing. He couldn't write. Unless this was a statement, a deposition taken before the arrest, or something else entirely. He turned the page over, checking the back. Nothing, just the smooth, unmarked surface of the cream paper. He looked at the date in the top right corner. 20 September 1922. 3 days before the stabbing. Groom's breath hitched in his throat, a dry, clicking sound. He glanced at Miller, who was still typing, lost in the rhythmic trance of the keyboard. Then he looked back at the letter. The first line seemed to pulse under the green light, the black ink rising off the page like smoke. "Do not do anything foolish, Eddie," Frederick had written. "Whatever you have planned, stop it. It is not worth the price." Groom stared at the words. The red pen lay on the desk, capped, harmless, but suddenly it looked like a detonator. If this letter existed, if it was part of the evidence, it destroyed the theory of a shared conspiracy. It showed Fred trying to restrain her, not incite her. It painted Edith as the sole architect of the fantasy, the lone driver of the momentum towards violence. Wallinger would not like this. The Crown would not like this. It complicated the clean, straight line of the indictment. It introduced doubt, and doubt was the enemy of the hangman. Groom's hand moved towards the letter, trembling. He should flag it. He should mark it for the chief inspector immediately. Protocol demanded it. Accuracy demanded it. But his fingers hovered over the page, refusing to touch it. To touch it was to acknowledge it. To acknowledge it was to set the machine in motion that would either bury this page or use it to hang them both with even greater certainty. Outside, the factory clanging bell sounded again, closer this time, a long, mournful cry that vibrated in the windowpane. The shift was over. The city was exhaling. Groom picked up the red pen. He uncapped it. The nib hovered over Frederick's plea. Stop it. He could underline it. He could highlight the warning. Or he could leave it blank, let it disappear into the stack of unremarkable correspondence, buried under the weight of Edith's more voluminous, more damning cries for help. The ink gathered at the tip of the pen, a single, waiting drop of blood. He lowered his hand. It struck the cream paper just below the date, a perfect, blooming sphere of crimson that swallowed the tail of the letter T in September. Groom watched it spread, the fibers of the expensive stock drinking the evidence before his eyes. He did not blot it. He did not reach for the rag tucked beneath the inkwell. He simply stared as the red bled outward, turning the warning into a stain, obscuring the command to stop. "Do not do anything foolish, Eddie." The words remained legible above the wound, but the violence of the mark changed their temperature. They were no longer a plea from a lover, they were an annotation of guilt. Miller's typing stopped. The sudden absence of that rhythmic clatter left a hole in the room, a vacuum that sucked the air from Groom's lungs. He could feel the other clerk's gaze on the back of his neck, heavy and inquisitive, though Miller said nothing. In this room, curiosity was a luxury no one could afford. You saw what was on the page, you transcribed it, and you let the blood dry where it fell. Groom capped the pen. The click sounded like a bone snapping. He lifted the sheet, holding it by the very edge of the corner, careful not to smear the wet ink onto his cuff. The paper felt different than Edith's letters. Hers were thin, translucent things that crinkled if you breathed on them too hard, written on whatever scrap she could find while Percy paced the floor below. This was solid, substantial. It had weight. Frederick Bywaters knew how to buy paper. He knew how to sign his name with a confidence that suggested he believed he had a future to sign it for. Groom placed the letter on the outbound pile, the one destined for the chief inspector's desk before the morning briefing. It sat there, stark and accusing against the grey wood of the desk, a single sheet of cream in a sea of onion skin. He reached for the next item in the box. His fingers brushed against rougher texture, the surface coarse and unbleached. A postcard. The image was a faded view of the Southend Pier, the ironwork skeletal against a printed sky, the colors washed out by sun and time. It had been posted on the 18th of September, 2 days before Frederick's letter. Groom turned it over. Edith's hand this time, but hurried. The loops were wide, desperate, the ink pressing so hard into the card that it had scored the paper on the reverse. She wasn't writing to Frederick here. She was writing to a friend in Birmingham, a woman named Mary who knew nothing of the gasworks or the stabbing or the red lines Groom was drawing through lives. "The house is so quiet now," Edith had written. "Percy is away on business for a few days, and I find I cannot sleep. The silence rings in my ears like a bell." Groom traced the word silence with his thumbnail. It felt hollow. If Percy was away on business on the 18th, then he was back by the 20th when Frederick wrote his warning. The timeline tightened, the noose of dates pulling snug around their necks. 3 days of freedom, 3 days of quiet, and then the return of the husband, the return of the reality that made Frederick beg for caution. He picked up the red pen again. His hand shook just once, a tremor that started in the shoulder and ran down to the wrist. He steadied it against the edge of the desk, the cold wood grounding him. "The silence rings in my ears like a bell." He underlined it once, twice, a double line of blood. In the context of the trial, this would not be read as loneliness. It would be the calm before the storm, the quiet of the predator waiting in the grass. The prosecution would take this card, hold it up to the jury, and ask them why a wife felt such relief in her husband's absence unless she was planning to ensure he never returned. Groom knew exactly how Wallinger would say it. He could hear the chief inspector's voice, dry and devoid of pity, weaving the narrative while Groom sat mute in the corner. She enjoyed the silence, gentlemen, she coveted it, and when the silence was threatened, she acted. It was a lie. Groom knew it was a lie because he had read the letters that came before, the ones where she described the shouting, the throwing of plates, the suffocating presence of a man who treated her like furniture. But the lie was cleaner. It fit better in the file. He marked the date on the postcard in the margin, Exhibit 14B. The ink was still wet on Frederick's letter next to it. The red drop had dried to a dark crust, flaking slightly as Groom shifted the pile. He brushed the flake away with his thumb. It left a smudge of red dust on his skin, a tiny fingerprint of complicity. Miller cleared his throat. The sound was sharp, artificial. "Tea?" Miller asked. He didn't look up from his machine. His hands hovered over the keys, ready to resume the rhythm the moment Groom answered. Groom looked at the clock on the wall. The hands were frozen at 4:20, the mechanism broken weeks ago and never repaired. Time in this room was measured only by the stack of paper on the left and the growing pile on the right. "No," Groom said. His voice sounded rusty, unused. "Not yet." "Suit yourself." Miller's fingers dropped. The clacking started again, faster this time, as if making up for lost time. Click-clack, click-clack. The sound filled the room, drowning out the distant rumble of a bus on Whitehall. Groom turned back to the box. There were more items, a receipt for a sleeping draught from a chemist in Ilford, a torn page from a diary, the edges jagged where it had been ripped out in haste, and a small, wrapped parcel tied with string. He picked up the parcel. It was light, almost insubstantial. He shook it gently. Something rattled inside, a dry, shifting sound like seeds in a pod. He should not open it. The seal was intact, marked with the Essex police wax. Protocol dictated that parcels be logged and opened in the presence of a senior officer. Wallinger would want to see this. Wallinger would want to control the reveal. But the string was loose. One end had come undone, perhaps in the transit from Ilford, perhaps pulled by the rough handling of the constable who had delivered the box. The paper wrapping was thin, brown, the kind grocers used for sugar or flour. Through a tear in the corner, Groom could see a glint of metal. Not a knife, not a gun. Something smaller. He looked at Miller. The clerk was absorbed in his work, his head bobbing slightly with the motion of the carriage return. The fog outside was thickening, pressing against the grime-streaked glass, turning the late afternoon into a premature twilight. The gas lamps had not been lit yet. The department was too cheap to burn them before 6. Groom slid his thumbnail under the loose end of the string. He pulled. The knot gave way with a soft sigh. The paper fell open. Inside lay a small glass vial, corked and sealed with wax. The liquid within was clear, colorless, harmless as water, but the label, handwritten in Edith's looping script, told a different story. For the pain, it read, when the shadows get too long. And beneath that, in a different hand, smaller and tighter, a single word added later. Enough. Groom held the vial up to the dim light. The liquid caught the grey glow from the window, shimmering with a deceptive purity. It looked like nothing. It looked like everything. If this was poison, it was the murder weapon. If it was medicine, it was proof of a nervous condition, a woman trying to cope with a miserable marriage. The difference between a hanging and a hospital bed sat in the palm of his hand, contained in 2 ounces of glass. He thought of Frederick's letter, "Stop it." He thought of Edith's postcard, "The silence rings." And now this, the potential end of the story, bottled and labeled. Groom's finger tightened around the glass. It was cold, leaching the warmth from his skin. He could put it back. He could tie the string, rewrap the paper, and place it in the box for Wallinger to find tomorrow. He could remain the scribe, the passive conduit, the man who merely copied what was put in front of him. Or he could look closer. He brought the vial to his eye, squinting against the dimness. There was a sediment at the bottom, a fine, white powder that had settled out of solution. It looked like sugar. It looked like arsenic. The door to the office creaked. Groom jerked his hand down, shoving the vial into the pocket of his waistcoat before he could think. The glass pressed against his ribs, cold and hard against his heart. Wallinger stood in the doorway. He was not wearing his coat, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms thick with grey hair. He held a folder under one arm, the leather bulging with papers. "Groom," the chief inspector said. His voice was flat, devoid of greeting. "The director wants the transcript of the September correspondence by morning, everything." His eyes moved to the desk, to the cream letter with the red stain, to the postcard, to the open box. They lingered for a fraction of a second on Groom's waistcoat, where the outline of the vial pressed against the fabric, but he gave no sign of seeing it. "Is there a problem?" Wallinger asked. Groom swallowed. The taste of copper was back, strong and metallic, coating his tongue. "No, sir," he said. "No problem at all." "Good." Wallinger stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind him. "Because the magistrate is asking questions about the timeline. He wants to know why the wife bought poison 2 weeks before the murder." Groom's hand went to his pocket, fingers curling around the glass. "Did she?" Groom asked. Wallinger smiled. It was a thin, humorless stretching of the skin. "That," he said, walking to the desk and placing the folder down with a heavy thud, "is exactly what we are going to tell him." He looked at Groom, his eyes dark and unreadable in the gloom. "Finish the transcription, Arthur, and leave the analysis to me." Groom nodded. He sat down. He picked up his pen. But the vial in his pocket burned against his side, a cold fire that refused to go out. Short, the ink pooled. Medium, he dragged the nib across the grain. Long, throughout the room, the dust motes settled like ash on the piles of unfinished paperwork that marked the progress of 100 other lives caught in the same slow-moving river of justice. A cramp seized the tendon beneath Groom's thumb, sharp and sudden, locking the digit against the barrel of the pen. He dropped the nib. It clattered onto the blotter, spinning once before settling in a pool of spilled ink that looked too much like dried blood for comfort. The stain bloomed outward, eating the fibers of the grey wool mat, creeping towards the edge of the desk, where the wood had been worn smooth by 30 years of anxious clerks. Groom stared at it, his breath hitching in a throat raw from the coal dust that drifted down from the ceiling vents, fine as ground pepper. He needed water. Not for the ink, which was ruined, but for the dryness scraping the back of his palate, a thirst that felt less like dehydration and more like the body rejecting the words he had just forced onto paper. "Leave it." Wallinger did not turn from the window. The chief inspector stood with his back to the room, hands clasped behind the tail of his frock coat, staring out at the courtyard where a rain-slicked hansom cab waited, its horse steaming in the chill air. The glass of the sash window was thick with grime, distorting the grey light of the October afternoon into something sickly and indistinct, like milk left too long in the sun. "Sir, the page is compromised," Groom said, reaching for the rag tucked beneath his inkwell. His voice sounded thin, stripped of authority by the high, echoing ceiling of the record room. "The transcription is incomplete. Line 4 breaks off mid-sentence." "The sentence is broken regardless of your spillage, Groom. It was broken the moment she wrote it." Wallinger turned then, his movement stiff, the joints of his knees popping with a sound like dry twigs snapping underfoot. He walked to the desk, his boots making no sound on the linoleum, and looked down at the ruined page. He did not frown. He did not sigh. He simply observed the destruction of evidence with the detached curiosity of a man examining a specimen in a jar. "She speaks of poison in that line, arsenic, or perhaps it was prussic acid. The distinction matters little to the jury, provided the word kill appears within 3 paragraphs. "It says wish, sir, not kill." Groom wiped his thumb on his trousers, leaving a smudge of black against the grey wool of his leg. "She writes, I wish the shadows would take him. It is metaphor, poetic despair. She is a woman trapped in a marriage she despises, not a plotter of homicide." Wallinger leaned forward, placing a heavy hand on the desk, trapping the ragged edge of the onion-skin paper beneath his palm. The smell of his tobacco mixture, coarse and sweet with cherry molding, rolled off him, overwhelming the faint scent of lavender that still clung to the letters. "Metaphor is a luxury for the drawing-room, Groom. Here, in the eyes of the Crown, it is admission. If she wishes a man dead, and that man dies with a knife in his groin, the wish becomes the warrant. Do not confuse the sentiment of a frightened wife with the innocence of a saint. There are no saints in Ilford, only survivors and the dead." Groom flinched, a small, involuntary jerking of the shoulder that he hoped the chief inspector had missed in the dim light. He had not missed it. Wallinger's eyes, pale and watery as the Thames at low tide, narrowed slightly. "Transcribe it as written," Wallinger commanded, his voice dropping to a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Do not edit, do not interpret, do not attempt to save her from her own flourishes. The prosecution will dissect every adjective, every hyperbole, every fevered dream she committed to paper. Your job is to provide them with the scalpel, nothing more." "But the contexto." "Context is for the defense, and they have none." Wallinger straightened, pulling a gold watch from his waistcoat pocket. He snapped the case open, glanced at the face, and snapped it shut with a decisive click that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "The magistrate arrives at 9 tomorrow. By then, I want every letter from the box sorted, dated, and transcribed in duplicate. The ones mentioning the seaman, Bywaters, go in the red folder. The ones mentioning the husband's health go in the blue. The rest can burn for all I care, though I suspect you will find they all lead back to the same conclusion." He turned away, walking back towards the door, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floorboards, swallowing the desk, the chair, and the ruined page. "And Groom, if you spill ink on the next sheet, you will clean it with your tongue. We cannot afford waste, not with the press sniffing around the corridors like hounds." The door clicked shut, the latch engaged with a finality that made Groom's teeth ache. He sat alone in the green glare of the lamp, the silence rushing back in to fill the space Wallinger had occupied, heavy and suffocating. The cramp in his thumb had subsided, leaving a dull, throbbing ache that radiated up his forearm. He looked at the ruined page, the black pool of ink now still, reflecting the flickering gas jet above. It looked like a hole punched through the world, a void where the truth should have been. Groom reached for a fresh sheet of bond paper, pulling it from the stack with trembling fingers. He dipped the new nib into the well, the metal cold against his skin, and hovered it over the blank surface. The words from the letter burned in his mind, bright and terrible. The shadows lengthen over the gasworks, Fred, and I feel the poison of this house seeping into my bones. He began to write. The scratch of the nib was loud, aggressive, tearing into the fiber of the paper. He wrote the date. He wrote the location. He wrote the words, forcing his hand to remain steady, to form the loops and curls of her handwriting with mechanical precision, stripping them of their fear, their desperation, their humanity. He turned her longing into evidence, her fantasy into fact, her cry for help into a noose. Outside, the distant wail of the barking gasworks' clanging bell cut through the fog, a mournful, industrial shriek that marked the end of the shift for thousands of men. It sounded like a warning. It sounded like a eulogy. Groom did not stop. He wrote until his hand cramped again, until the letters blurred into a grey smear, until the only thing that existed was the next word, and the next, and the next, marching relentlessly towards a verdict that had already been written in ink long before he ever touched the pen. A draft from the windowsill fluttered the corner of the red folder, lifting it just enough to reveal the name typed on the label in bold, black capitals, THOMPSON, Exhibit A. The paper settled back down, but the name remained exposed, staring up at him from the desk, waiting for the next page to be turned. The red folder lay flat, a slab of cardboard authority that refused to be ignored. Groom stared at it until the bold capitals swam, the letters THOMPSON and Exhibit merging into a single, jagged scar across his vision. He needed water. His throat felt lined with the dry dust of the coal fire that had long since gone cold in the grate, a grit that swallowed saliva and made swallowing an act of deliberate will. He stood, the chair legs scraped against the linoleum, a harsh, grating shriek that tore through the room's heavy quiet. He winced. Even the furniture seemed to resent his movement. Crossing to the corner, where a chipped enamel jug sat beside a tin cup, he poured. The water glugged, splashing over the rim and pooling on the desk surface, creeping towards the stack of onion skin letters. He grabbed a rag, mopping the spill before it could touch the evidence. Wet wool smell rose from the cloth, sour and damp. He drank the rest in 3 gulps, the liquid lukewarm and tasting faintly of the iron pipes that fed it. It did nothing to wash away the metallic tang of fear coating his tongue. Careless, he whispered to the empty room. The word hung there, small and pathetic. Wallinger would have called it incompetence. Groom called it a tremor. His hand, resting on the edge of the desk, shook again, a fine, rapid vibration that traveled up his wrist. He clenched it into a fist, nails digging into the palm until the pain sharpened, grounding him. He returned to the chair, sat. The leather creaked, a sound like a joint popping. The next letter waited. It was lighter than the others, the paper thinner, almost translucent. He recognized the handwriting immediately. The loops were tighter, the pressure heavier, the ink darker. Frederick Bywaters, the seaman, the co-accused. The man whose name was already being shouted by newsboys on the corners of Fleet Street, though they knew nothing of the man himself, only the shape of the scandal. Groom smoothed the paper. A crease ran diagonally across the top corner, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times, tucked into a pocket, pressed against a heart. He could almost smell the salt air of the docks on it, a phantom scent of tar and brine that clashed with the stale tobacco of the yard. "Dearest Eddie," it began. The pet name struck him like a physical blow. Eddie, not the accused, not the adulteress, not the woman who had supposedly plotted her husband's death with cold, calculating precision. Just Eddie, a woman waiting for a lover to return from sea. He dipped the pen. The nib caught a glob of ink, swelling dark and viscous. He touched it to the page. "I am thinking of you every hour. The ship feels like a prison without you. I wish I could come home and take you away from all this." Groom paused. The nib hovered, a drop of ink gathering at the tip, threatening to fall. "Take you away." It was a promise, a desperate, impossible promise. In the context of a love letter, it was romance. In the context of a murder trial, with Percy Thompson dead and a knife found in the gutter, it became an instruction, a plan, an admission of intent to remove the obstacle. Wallinger's voice echoed in his head. "The wish becomes the warrant." He forced the pen down. The scratch returned, louder now, more aggressive. He transcribed the words, copying the slant, the spacing, the desperate urgency of the hand that had written them. But as he wrote, he felt the meaning shift, curdle. He was not preserving a memory, he was forging a weapon. Every loop of the Y in away, every cross of the T in take, was another link in the chain he was building around their necks. A fly buzzed against the window pane, a frantic, stumbling sound against the glass. It threw itself at the barrier again and again, unable to understand the transparency that trapped it. Groom watched it for a moment, mesmerized by its futile struggle. Then he looked back at the page. If he makes trouble, I don't know what I shall do. I might lose my head. Groom stopped. The ink blot grew, spreading slowly into the fiber of the bond paper, a dark, expanding star. He should have blotted it. He should have started again. Wallinger's threat about cleaning the floor with his tongue rang in his ears. He didn't move. I might lose my head. Was it a figure of speech, a hyperbole born of frustration, or was it a confession? In the fevered logic of the prosecution, it was both. It didn't matter what Fred meant. It only mattered what the jury would hear, and they would hear a threat. They would hear a man promising violence, a woman waiting for the blow to fall. Groom picked up the blotting paper. He pressed it down onto the wet ink, holding it there until his knuckles turned white. When he lifted it, the smear remained, a grey ghost of the words beneath. "Damn you," he muttered. He wasn't sure who he was talking to, Fred, Edith, Wallinger, himself. He reached for the next sheet. His fingers brushed the edge of the red folder again. The label seemed to glow in the green light. Exhibit A, the first brick in the wall. There were dozens more letters in the box below, hundreds of pages of intimate thoughts, petty grievances, longing and fear. All of them would be sorted. All of them would be transcribed. All of them would be stripped of their context and laid out on the table at the Old Bailey like specimens on a dissection tray. He thought of Edith Thompson sitting in a cell in Holloway, perhaps writing another letter that would never be sent. Did she know? Did she understand that every word she had written in the privacy of her bedroom was now public property, owned by the state, twisted into a narrative of guilt she could never escape? Probably not. People never saw the trap until the jaws snapped shut. Groom dipped the pen again. The inkwell was running low. He would need to refill it soon. The ritual of it soothed him, the mechanical repetition of dip, scrape, write. It allowed him to stop thinking. If he thought too much, he might stop writing altogether. And if he stopped, Wallinger would send someone else. Someone who wouldn't hesitate. Someone who wouldn't feel the weight of the words pressing down on their chest. He wrote faster now, the script becoming hurried, less precise. He chased the words, trying to outrun the implication of them. The poison, the shadows, the knife. They piled up on the page, a catalogue of doom. Outside, the fog thickened. The gaslight in the corridor flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched under the door and reached for his ankles. The building groaned, the old pipes knocking in the walls like a restless heartbeat. London was settling in for the night, a city of millions of secrets, most of them harmless, some of them deadly. Groom finished the paragraph. He lifted the pen, the nib dry now, scratching uselessly against the paper. He needed more ink. He reached for the bottle, his hand steady for the first time in an hour. As he unscrewed the cap, a sound drifted up from the street below. Not the siren this time, something softer, a newsboy perhaps, or the distant clatter of a hansom cab on the cobbles. No, it was singing. A drunken, off-key rendition of a music hall tune, slurred and broken by the wind. Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag. The song trailed off, swallowed by the fog. Groom froze. The bottle of ink hung in his hand, suspended over the open page. One slip, one tremor. A single drop of black ink could ruin the sheet, obscure a crucial line, create an ambiguity that might, just might, sow a seed of doubt. He looked at the letter, I might lose my head. He looked at the ink, dark, deep, final. His finger tightened on the glass neck of the bottle. The cool smoothness bit into his skin. It would be so easy. An accident. A clumsy mistake by a tired clerk. Who would know? Who would care about one spoiled page in a mountain of evidence? The silence in the room pressed in, heavy and expectant. The fly had stopped buzzing. The building held its breath. Groom's hand began to shake again, not the fine tremor from before, but a violent, uncontrollable spasm that rattled the bottle, making the liquid inside slosh against the glass. He fought it, locking his wrist, gritting his teeth until his jaw ached. He would not do it. He could not. He was a clerk, a conduit, a machine. He lowered the bottle. Carefully, slowly, he set it down on the desk, miles away from the paper. He picked up the pen instead. The nib touched the page. The scratch resumed. He wrote the next word, and the next. November rain needled the windowpane, blurring the gas lamp glow on Whitehall Place into smeared yellow bruises. Inside the record room, the air tasted of wet wool and the sharp, metallic tang of iron gall ink that never quite dried. Arthur Groom rubbed his eyes with the heel of a stained hand, the skin rough from weeks of constant friction against paper edges. His wrist ached, a deep, throbbing complaint that traveled up the forearm to settle in the shoulder like a lodged bullet. He pushed the latest transcription aside. The page curled at the corners, damp from the humidity seeping through the sash windows. "Still at it, Groom?" The voice came from the doorway, dry and expectant. Groom did not look up immediately. He finished the loop on the letter G, capped the nib, and only then turned his head. Mr. Halloway stood there, holding a bowler hat that dripped steadily onto the linoleum. Water pooled around his shoes, darkening the grey tiles. "The stack grows, Halloway. It does not shrink." Halloway stepped into the room, shaking the umbrella with a sharp flick that sent droplets flying onto a nearby filing cabinet. He moved with the brisk efficiency of a man who measures his life in billable hours, though neither of them saw a penny of the fees generated by this tragedy. "Wallinger wants the batch on the desk by morning. The Director of Public Prosecutions is reviewing the evidence list tomorrow." Halloway leaned against the doorframe, picking a piece of lint from his lapel. "He says the defense is asking for copies of the correspondence dated prior to July." Groom's stomach tightened. July, the month before the stabbing, the period where Edith's fantasies shifted from vague discontent to specific, violent imagery. "They are entitled to them," Groom said. His voice sounded raspy, unused for hours. "Entitled," Halloway repeated, tasting the word like sour milk. "They are entitled to hang themselves if they wish. Our job is to ensure the rope is strong enough." He walked over to the desk, peering down at the scattered sheets. His shadow fell across the latest page, obscuring the words, "I will try and get the stuff." Groom instinctively shifted his hand to cover the line, a futile gesture of protection. "That one," Halloway said, pointing a manicured finger at the covered text. "Wallinger wants it highlighted, red ink, make it stand out." "It is already clear." "Clearer," Halloway straightened up, adjusting his cuffs. "People skim, Arthur. They read the headlines, not the footnotes. If the prosecution is to prove premeditation, the jury needs to see the intent without squinting. Make it bleed on the page." Groom looked at the bottle of ink. It sat near his elbow, dark and viscous. He remembered the tremor from weeks ago, the temptation to spill, to obscure, to introduce a doubt that did not exist in the original script. The memory sat heavy in his gut, a stone swallowed whole. "If I highlight every reference to poison, it will look like a pharmacist's ledger," Groom said. "She wrote about powders in the context of illness, of headaches. And yet her husband died of a stab wound while carrying a package of ground glass." Halloway's voice dropped, losing its bureaucratic sheen. "Do not defend her, Groom. You are not her counsel. You are the mirror. Mirrors do not argue with the reflection." Halloway turned to leave, his shoes squeaking on the wet floor. He paused at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder. The gaslight caught the grey in his beard, turning him into a sketch of an older man, weary and hardened. "Besides," Halloway added, "the judge has already indicated his view on the admissibility of the letters. He calls them remarkable documents, remarkable in the sense of being damning. Do not waste your empathy on a woman who discussed prussic acid over breakfast." The door clicked shut, the latch engaged with a finality that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. Groom sat alone with the scratch of the radiator pipes and the distant, mournful hooter of the barking gasworks calling the night shift. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, a low frequency that settled in his teeth. He looked down at the letter. Edith's handwriting was looping, elegant, deceptively soft. The ink she had used was blue-black, now fading to a rusty brown on the original onion skin. He reached for the red pen. The cap came off with a pop. The nib hovered over the word stuff. His hand did not shake this time. The paralysis of moral choice had burned itself out, leaving only the cold ash of duty. He pressed the nib down. A red line slashed through the text, bright and arterial against the faded blue. It looked like a wound. He moved to the next line. If only you were here to help me. Another slash. I feel so desperate, slash. The red marks accumulated, turning the page into a map of violence that perhaps never existed in the room where the words were written, but now existed undeniably on the evidence table. He was not just transcribing, he was annotating the path to the gallows. A draft from the window chilled the back of his neck. He shivered, pulling his cardigan tighter around his thin frame. The room felt smaller than it had an hour ago, the walls closing in as the pile of completed transcripts grew higher on his left. He reached for the next letter from the box. The paper was different this time, thicker, cream-colored stock. The envelope had been opened hastily, the torn edge jagged. He pulled out the sheet and smoothed it flat. The date at the top read 14 September 1922, 3 weeks before the murder. He began to read, his lips moving silently as he decoded the hurried script. The content was different, less fantasy, more fear. She wrote of being watched, of her husband's suspicion, of a sense that the walls were listening. Groom dipped the pen in the black ink. He touched the nib to the fresh sheet. Before he could write the first word, a heavy knock rattled the door. Not the polite tap of Holloway, but the flat, authoritative pound of a uniformed officer. Groom froze, the nib hovering a millimeter above the paper. One slip now would ruin the sheet, but the hand that held the pen remained steady, anchored by a sudden, grim curiosity. "Enter," he called out. The door opened, and a constable stepped in, holding a sealed envelope marked with the crest of H.M. Prison Holloway. The man's face was pale, his uniform damp with the fog from outside. He did not look at Groom, but at the box of letters on the desk. "Special delivery, Mr. Groom," the constable said, his voice flat. "From the prisoner. She requested this be added to the file before the committal." Groom set the pen down. The inkwell seemed to pulse in the green light. "From Mrs. Thompson." "Yes, sir, direct from the governor." The constable placed the envelope on top of the red-slashed page. "She said it was urgent, that it clarifies the previous statements." Groom looked at the envelope. The handwriting was shaky, the loops broken. It looked nothing like the elegant script from July. It looked like the writing of someone whose hand had forgotten how to hold a pen, or perhaps someone who was writing with a hand that trembled too much to control the flow. He reached for the paper knife. "Leave it," Groom said. The constable hesitated, then nodded and withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. Groom slid the blade under the flap. The paper tore with a dry rip. He pulled out the single sheet inside. It was short, only 3 lines. He read them once, then again. The blood drained from his face, leaving him cold despite the wool of his cardigan. He looked at the door, then back at the letter. The red pen lay beside it, a bloody accusation waiting to be made. He picked up the black nib instead. The ink refused to flow. Groom pressed harder, the nib scraping against the grain of the transcription paper, a dry, scratching sound that filled the sudden vacuum left by the constable's departure. A blot formed, dark and spreading, swallowing the space where the date should have gone. He did not reach for the blotting paper immediately. Instead, he stared at the 3 lines from Holloway, the words burning into his retina with a clarity that made the rest of the room dissolve into grey mush. "I did not mean the words as they were taken. The poison was for me, not him. Burn this." 3 lines, a lifetime of distinction compressed into a plea that would never see the light of day. Groom finally grabbed the blotter, pressing it down with a force that crumpled the edge of the fresh sheet. The damp ink lifted, leaving a ghostly smear but the damage was done. The page was ruined. It did not matter. None of the pages mattered if the truth sat in this envelope, sealed by the governor's wax and destined for the file marked Exhibit C. He looked at the red pen. It lay on the desk like a severed digit, the cap rolling slightly as the floorboards shifted under the weight of a passing truck on Whitehall. The red ink inside was thick, opaque, designed to obscure, to correct, to condemn. It was the color of the markings Holloway wanted on every mention of powders and shadows. It was the color of the arterial Groom had just drawn through Edith's desperate fantasy of escape. If he transcribed this new letter, he would be creating a record of her recantation. He would be putting into the official hand of the Crown the very evidence that might unravel their narrative of premeditated malice. The prosecution argued she had plotted the death of Percy Thompson with the cold calculation of a spider weaving a web. This note said the web was a trap she had built for herself, and she had fallen into it alone. But the rules were absolute. Clerks must act as conduits without adding commentary or interpretation to evidence. The words of the manual echoed in his head, stripped of their bureaucratic comfort and revealed as a commandment of silence. To transcribe was to validate, to file was to seal. If he wrote these words down in his neat, clerkly hand, they would become part of the machine. They would be typed, copied, served to the defense, and then dissected by the prosecution until the poison was for me became, she admitted access to poison, and burn this became an attempt to destroy evidence. The machine ate nuance for breakfast. Groom pushed the transcription paper aside. The clean sheet waited, blank and accusing. He dipped the pen again, the nib glistening with black ink that looked too much like blood in the green-shaded light. He hovered over the paper. The radiator hissed, a sudden burst of steam that made him flinch. The sound was sharp, violent, a reminder of the pressure building in the pipes, in the building, in the city itself. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, a solid wall of yellow-gray that erased the world beyond the window. There was no escape from this room. There was no escape from the box on the desk, or the box waiting at Holloway, or the final box that waited at Pentonville. He began to write. Special delivery received 10 October 1922. His hand moved mechanically, forming the letters with the precision of a man who had spent 20 years copying other people's sins. He did not write the content of the letter. He could not. To write it was to enter it into the log, and once it was in the log, it belonged to them. Origin HM Prison Holloway, recipient CID Records. He stopped, the nib hovered, trembling now, betraying the stillness he tried to project. The ink gathered at the tip, a heavy droplet threatening to fall and ruin the second line. If he burned it, he destroyed evidence. A criminal act, obstruction of justice. He would lose his post, perhaps his freedom, and the letter would still be missing. Holloway would know. The governor of Holloway would know. There would be inquiries, other clerks, other pens. The truth was not a fragile thing that could be snuffed out by one match. It was a weed that grew through cracks in the pavement, unstoppable once the seed was sown. But if he filed it, he killed her. Not physically. That was the hangman's job, a grim mechanic in a bowler hat who would do his duty with a rope and a trapdoor. No, Groom would kill the version of Edith Thompson that was capable of fear, of regret, of loving someone enough to wish for her own death rather than another's. He would kill the woman who wrote in shaky loops and replace her with the monster of the indictment, the femme fatale of the tabloids, the cold-hearted adulteress who plotted murder with a fountain pen. The droplet fell. It hit the paper with a soft plip, spreading into a perfect, dark sphere. Groom watched it grow, mesmerized by the way it distorted the fibers of the page. It looked like an eye watching him. He grabbed the envelope. The paper was cheap, the kind issued to prisoners, thin and rough against his thumb. He could feel the texture of the other side through the sheet, the impression of her handwriting pressing into the fiber. He turned it over. The seal was intact, a wafer of red wax stamped with the prison crest. Breaking it was the first step. Transcribing was the second. Filing was the end. He looked at the grate in the corner of the room. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, pulsing with a dull orange heat that offered no warmth to the room, but plenty to the waste bin beside it. The bin was metal, dented, smelling of ash, and discarded cigarette ends. Groom stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, a harsh shriek that made him wince. He walked to the grate, the envelope clutched in his hand. His heart was not pounding. It was a heavy, slow drum in his chest, counting down the seconds until the choice was made for him. He knelt. The heat from the embers hit his face, dry and choking. He held the envelope over the glow. The paper began to curl at the edges, the wax seal softening, losing its definition. "Burn this," she had asked. It was a command from the prisoner to the scribe. Was it not his duty to obey? His hand shook. The envelope dipped too low. A tongue of flame licked the corner, blackening the paper, eating the crest. The smell of burning hair and scorched cloth filled his nose, acrid and immediate. He pulled it back. The corner was gone, charred and crumbling. The seal was a mess of melted red goo, but the words inside were safe, for now. Groom stood, his knees cracking, and returned to the desk. He placed the damaged envelope on top of the transcript pile. It sat there, a ruined thing among the neat stacks of paper, a visible wound in the orderly progression of the case. He sat down. He picked up the red pen. He uncapped it. The smell of the ink was sharp, chemical, cutting through the scent of smoke that clung to his clothes. He looked at the letter from Holloway, then at the transcript of the September 14th letter where Edith spoke of being watched. He drew a line. A thick red slash through the words, "I feel so desperate." Then another through, "The walls are listening." He marked them as significant, as evidence of a guilty mind, as proof of her knowledge of the atmosphere of fear she claimed to inhabit. He twisted her words until they broke, until they meant exactly what the Crown needed them to mean. And then, with a steady hand, he took the letter from Holloway and slid it into the file folder without transcribing a single word. He sealed the folder with wax from the candle on his desk, pressing his own signet ring into the soft pool. The wax hardened quickly, cooling to a dull, opaque red. Groom blew out the candle. The room plunged into darkness, save for the green glare of the desk lamp, which now seemed to spotlight only the file, the box, and his own stained hands. He sat back, folding his arms, waiting for the next knock, the next order, the next piece of a life to be dismantled and filed away. The gasworks hooter sounded again, closer this time, a long, mournful cry that seemed to come from inside the walls. Groom closed his eyes. He listened to the silence that wasn't silence at all, but the sound of the city holding its breath, waiting for the morning when the file would be opened and the truth would be read aloud in a court of law, stripped of its context, its fear, and its plea for fire. He opened his eyes and reached for the next box. The Ink of Ilford is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Edith Thompson and Frederick Bywaters. 1953 Coronation Honors. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.